The Rune Smith. Chapter 51. Nothing is real. Roland was standing in the middle of the corridor with his hand holding the blade that he previously made. He had looked at it many times before, but this was a first. Thanks to his debugging skill, he was able to always see the runic structures of any item that he came across. If he focused on it, the skill would show him various colored lines, red, blue, and green. He had already seen how his blade should look while under his skill, and something was very off. The traces were wrong, they didn't fit the sword that he made, and this wasn't even the oddest thing here. Roland moved his eyes up and glanced at the walls. He looked at the doors and even the ceiling. He could see them, traces were everywhere. It was as if everything in here had runes inscribed into them. He had come to this place many times and even used his skill before to glance at some items, but nothing like this ever happened. Something was really wrong here. Even the potted plant that was in the corner had runic components on it. He quickly ran downstairs. He wanted to ask Zilyana if she noticed something. The moment he got downstairs, he saw the elf just standing there, her body consumed by runic traces. Roland backed away. The elf covered in runic symbols just looked at him and smiled. "Oh? What's the rush? Are you sure that you don't want some tea?" She giggled and gave him the brightest smile that she could. This only made Roland shake his head. He decided to leave the store for now. On the outside it was all the same. Magical pathways were littering the streets and the buildings. Even the sky was full of them. He deactivated his skill and shook his head side to side while trying to gather his thoughts. The moment the skill wasn't active, he saw the world as he normally did. Nothing looked out of place. He squatted down and touched the soil. He even picked some up and let it fall through his fingers. This was strange indeed. Even without using his debugging skill, he should be able to somehow feel the runes in items. Without his debugging active, he couldn't feel the characteristic mana signature that an active runic structure would give out. Illusion. His mind wandered in a certain direction as he reactivated his skill again. He now looked at the runic components that were around him. The structures were more advanced than anything he had ever seen. Grand no greater rune. If it was a grand rune, then it would be something on a tier 4 level. These structures were more advanced than common ones, but not by that much. This had to be a greater runic structure. He had diagrams on various runes, lesser and common. Depending on the type of spell the runes belonged to, some of the components would repeat themselves. An ice arrow rune would share some components that an ice blast rune had. The same was in this situation, as he recognized some of those structures. Some of the runic formations looked similar to runes that had to do with illusions. There were also some that were from runes that affected the target's state of mind. He could see something similar to a sleep rune component, just more intricate. From his observations, he deduced that he had fallen victim to some kind of illusion spell. This world that he was seeing was not real. When it happened was a mystery though. He activated his skill when he was back at his workshop, so it had to have happened after he left. Was he attacked in the street or when he arrived at the company store? Also, why someone would even do this evaded him. Did he get caught up in another mess of the gnome manager? It had been 1.5 years since the home invasion incident. He had almost forgotten about it till this moment. No item he had could protect him from a mental attack of this magnitude. Am I trapped in here? He looked around, his heart pounding fast. He had no idea what the person that put him in this illusion was doing outside. Was he holding a dagger to his throat while he was here, unable to do anything? With the skill activated, he started looking around. Even though these runic structures were more advanced, they were still just runes. He had spent years studying them and he knew how to tell the pathways apart from each other. There was always one prime rune, through which everything connected. Without that rune the whole spell would instantly collapse. Maybe if he found it he could destroy or alter it. If he could damage these runic structures was still unclear, but he didn't have much time for a test. He could see some people walking around, looking at him. In this world he was alone and he didn't know if it had some kind of defensive mechanism. It would be unwise to alert his enemy to his knowledge. It was better to find the prime rune first and destroy it. Roland could even see in what direction it was. There were many runic pathways going in one direction, in the direction of his workshop. This world of illusions was probably made from his memories and his workshop had most of them. He would probably find what he was looking for there. He strapped his sword to his side. Even though it wasn't real, it probably would work against the denizens of this world. He walked while slightly rushing. He could feel strange gazes on his back that were giving him the chills. Was there even anything behind him, or was it just the figment of his imagination? The walk back to his workshop felt really long, but he managed to arrive without anything out of the ordinary happening. He quickly opened up the entrance and ducked inside, closing the reinforced door right behind him and locking it. He gave out a sigh and quickly quieted down. It was really silent in here, he couldn't hear anything outside either. He still wasn't sure what this illusion world was or how it operated. A runic item that could produce something like this must have been made with some high-quality materials. But where there was a runic artifact that was active, the caster was probably not far behind. Some items could be activated remotely and could even run on their own depending on the manufacturing process. There had to be someone to activate it unless he walked into some kind of trap that set it off instead. Roland activated his debugging skill. The pathways converged into one spot, into his forge. The one he was using was made from bricks but now looked like a Christmas tree. There were various magical pathways, some were quite red. Apparently, this greater rune wasn't quite perfect. The pathways connected to a larger rune that was in the middle. This was the prime rune. It consisted of many other runic components that were inside a magic circle. This prime rune was on the inside of the circle right in the middle. The other runes and runic components were around it in another outer circle. Roland moved towards the forge that was part of this illusion of a workshop. It was really convincing as he couldn't really notice a difference between this world and the real one, at all. He placed his digit on one of the runic pathways and tried rubbing on it. This didn't achieve anything at all. Even when he grabbed a metal tool to scratch the brick material, the magical pathway remained in place. It remained floating in the air instead of sinking back into the brick. It was as if the forge wasn't even there to begin with. I guess it won't be that easy. He moved his finger towards that magical pathway that he tried to rub off his forge. He injected some of his mana into his fingertip before moving towards the runic structure. As a runesmith, he was someone that was able to affect runic structures with his own mana. With the help of rune crafting, he was able to repair runes but also destroy them. It was part of the process. You just removed the faulty components and replaced them with the good ones. The moment he touched the trace and activated his skill, he saw it crumbling apart. This was only one of the many that he had to remove before the whole structure became unstable. The moment he did this, he could feel the earth trembling a bit. It was as if a small earthquake was taking place. The magical pathway that he severed with his finger started to slowly mend itself back into shape. It seemed that this rune had some sort of self-repairing property, but it was slow enough for him to continue his work. The more pathways he destroyed, the more the world shook. It was as if this illusion was reacting to his interference. I should probably hurry up, he thought to himself while getting a bad feeling. The pathways were slowly regenerating, but he was able to sever them faster. After getting one of the larger components fully, he could feel the whole workshop shake. The walls started cracking and the wooden beams strained themselves to hold the warehouse together. He wasn't quite done yet, as this prime rune was a lot more intricate than what he was used to. While he was going for another part, he suddenly heard a knock on the door. It started off quiet, like a normal everyday knock, but soon turned to loud pounding. He didn't even look back to his door. He was convinced that this was some sort of defensive mechanism of this world. It had probably noticed that he was messing with the prime rune structure and it was now here to stop him. He had no idea if there were some kind of rules in this illusion world. Though from the fact that the thing that was outside wasn't rushing in to stop him, there had to be something. The loud thumping sound stopped after a while and he continued with the rune destruction. That was until he heard a voice behind the door. "Roland, let me in, it's me." He jerked slightly after hearing the voice. He clearly recognized the owner of it. "Helsi. Yes, I've come back, please open the door, it's cold out here. He could clearly hear her. This world was somehow reaching into his memory and pulling out people that he would probably be willing to let inside his workshop. The moment of pause didn't stop him, he just grabbed the hammer that he was using for runesmithing. Roland injected his mana into the tool and delivered a blow to his forge. The runic pathways and components quickly became distorted after the strong blow. The Helsey outside started shouting frantically and the pounding on the door continued. He started sweating and continued with the destruction of this runic structure. It was a lot harder than he expected, probably due to his skill being low compared to this intricate rune. Why won't you let us in? Another voice was heard by him, this time not at the door but a floor above by the window. He gazed at it momentarily and could see a female hand reaching through it. This was the window that his half-gnome assistant had once sneaked in. He had long since put an iron grate there. All of his windows were now barred as he really didn't want anyone climbing through them. This hand and voice was different, it was very muscular and the voice sounded deeper, but he still recognized it. Sahildr. It was the voice of his old party member, and she wasn't alone. All the other windows in this warehouse were now occupied by some people that he previously knew. He could even hear the voice of his maid Martha. Anyone that had treated him nicely was apparently here. This illusion world was trying to lower the defenses of the afflicted person with their loved ones. Most people were more willing to let their guard down around their friends. In this situation, though, it looked like a bunch of zombies were trying to get inside and tear him apart. Roland delivered another blow to the forge and saw the runes crack. All of the destruction was starting to affect this world. The shaking didn't stop and he could hear lightning bolts and loud wind outside. The wooden workshop began to also crack. This event caused the door to finally break. He had destroyed most of the prime rune, but time was running out. The Helsey that was outside of the door started pushing herself in. The door was barely holding itself shut on the top hinge. What he saw wasn't the assistant that he remembered though. Her body was contorting in odd ways and she looked like some kind of creature from a horror movie. Even though there wasn't much space to crawl through, the monster Helsey didn't care. It forced itself inside, its flesh coming undone and the outer layer of the skin remained outside the door while the monstrosity squeezed itself in. Roland finally delivered another strike to the runic structure that caused the whole world to become unstable. The whole workshop tilted to the side and all of the blacksmithing tools flew off the shelves and tables. The other monsters started bursting through the windows while the Helsey one jumped forward. The part that would be its chest opened up to show a massive set of shark-like teeth. In the middle was what looked to be a giant tongue. The tongue split into many smaller tendrils and shot forward towards Roland. Luckily for Roland, this world still had rules in it. The tentacles rebounded off a semi-transparent red shield that caused those tendrils to burn. He wasn't far behind. He grabbed a magic paddle weapon that he had on his side and pointed it at the confused monster. A large burst of flames in the form of an arrow shot out. The flame arrow flew at a high speed, hitting the monster in the middle. The monstrosity exploded, chunks of guts and meat followed suit and covered the whole workshop in it. The other monsters weren't far behind. They flung their tentacles at the shield of flames and continued to smack it until it broke. Roland could feel something grabbing his legs. It didn't feel like anything human. He had no time as the monsters were upon him. He had to destroy this prime rune. He swung his hammer down while a sharp tendril pierced his chest at about the same moment. He coughed up red and felt a metallic taste, and the whole world began to distort even more. His eyes started getting blurry and everything went white as he passed out. You should praise me. If it wasn't for me, you'd never get through all these traps. Roland heard a voice. He gasped out for air but remained silent for the most part. He could feel that he was back in the store. He was sprawled out on the floor with his head towards an open door to the gnome manager's office. There were voices coming from there. One was female and the other was male. Stop! Wasting time. The woman finished the man's sentence and Roland could hear footsteps coming towards him. He wasn't sure what was happening at all. Who were those two and how did they get in here? For now, he played dead. the people here probably thought that he was still affected by the illusion. Next to him he could feel someone else. It was Zilyana, and she had collapsed a bit further into the office. "It's not even that late, we have enough time to play around with these two," the woman proclaimed while grabbing Zilyana by her hair and lifting her up with one hand. The elf's legs and arms were dangling around as if she was a rag doll. She was clearly out cold, probably affected by the same mind-affecting spell. He could hear Zilyana's body getting dragged inside the gnome manager's office. If the gnome was still alive or not, he had no idea. He also noticed something. The man placed an item on a table before walking towards the woman who was dragging Zilyana along. He could feel the strange mana signature of the thing on the table. It had to be the magical device responsible for this whole thing. He would probably only have one shot at this, and he had to make it count. He had made a better version of the magical paddle with his staple fire arrow spell. After getting the skill that helped him condense the runes, he was able to achieve that. He had used it in the world of the illusion, and he had it strapped to his belt as he always carried it as a backup weapon. The easiest way to get the elf and the gnome to wake up would be to destroy that magical device. The explosion might also alert the guards. He could also try to run, but he felt like the two people in this room were far stronger than him. He might not reach the end of the corridor before getting a dagger or something else stuck in his back. He slowly moved his hand towards his belt and the magic weapon that was strapped to it. He just needed to be quiet and get a good shot in, but if he failed, he would be a dead man. Chapter 52, Making a Decision. The night was dark and the whole city was lit up by the light of the lanterns. The winds had picked up and it started to drizzle. It looked like it would be a cold, stormy night. The guards that were patrolling the city moved slowly, mostly keeping to the buildings and hiding from the rain. In one of the better-off sections of the city was Exier's Magic Emporium. It was late and close to 9 p.m. now. Almost everyone had left the store and was now either at home or out in the pub. However, there was still light shining in the building, mostly through one window in particular. This very window was getting closed by a man in a black robe. There was a collapsed gnome in the room next to some alchemy equipment. By the entrance door to this lab, there was a female elf. To normal people, she might have looked like a sun elf, but this man saw through her disguise. The man placed a double helix-looking magical device on a nearby table after closing the window. The artifact gave off a red glow and the helixes revolved around each other while this item was active. Besides these three, there were two more people in close proximity. One was a tall human youth that was passed out close to the female elf. The other was another woman in a black robe that was similar to the one this man was wearing. She was now bringing the passed out woman over. She did this by dragging her by her long hair. Her legs were dangling and her arms were flopping around without any strength in them. "That toy always makes things so boring," the woman said while sighing. She tossed the passed out Zilyana into the room while complaining. "Do not talk about our Lord's artifact in such a way. It is a blessing from the Lord of the Abyss," the man replied in a monotone voice while glaring at his partner in crime. The woman had her hood down so you could see her smiling widely after the man got mad. "I wouldn't dare, our Lord is truly merciful." The woman shrugged while replying, her tone indicating a hint of mockery. The two clearly had different views about this Lord they were speaking of. "Can we at least take their bags? They won't be needing them." The woman smirked while pointing to the bags that both the gnome and the elf had on their sides. The man didn't answer, and that was enough for the obsidian-skinned elf to move closer. She took out an intricate-looking dagger and pointed it towards the unmoving bodies of the gnome and elf. Unbeknownst to the two, the third person that was there was quite awake. The Tier 1 class holder that was there didn't seem like a threat to these two assassins. They were preoccupied with the target and his hidden guard to pay attention to the sleeping youth. This would turn out to be one of the biggest mistakes that they could have made. Roland waited patiently. He started moving his hand towards his belt where he had one of his magical wands attached. They still looked like pieces of wide metal with a handle. After getting the knack of steel weapons, he had created one that could support his fire arrow spell. There were some downsides in making a weapon like this. The charges a regular steel weapon could hold was limited. Even with the highest rune quality and the help of the rune compression skill, at most he could squeeze out 10 charges. The runic components would erode afterward. That is also why he kept the paddle-like design. With the added thickness and wide shape he could repair it more often. After each repair, some of the material would be lost, but these wands didn't need to keep an edge, so it was fine. Finally, he saw the opportunity to strike. The woman pulled out her dagger and started going for the bags of holding. He grasped his weapon and was ready to point it at the strange artifact that was radiating with an unusual mana signature. The man in the black robe didn't look like he would be waiting much more. He moved his hand up and Roland could hear some strange cracking noises. It was as if bones were being broken. He had to act now. He knew that this was probably the only way he would survive. These two were far above him in levels. He didn't think that he would be able to make it down the corridor if he ran. He would probably get stabbed by the strange black-looking elven woman. She looked like the speedy type, and agility was the stat that Roland lacked the most. He knew that Zuliana wasn't what she seemed. She was the only person that could get him out of this bind. He also wasn't sure how strong the gnome was in a fight, but he also could have a trick up his sleeve. There was a slight delay with the spell activation. To be on the safe side, he needed to inject his mana before aiming with his steel wand. The downside of this was that he couldn't focus on his target before activating his weapon. He had no choice though, as otherwise, he might lose the element of surprise. A large thick tentacle rose from the man's long sleeve but stopped midway. He was about to devour the gnome that was on the floor. He had carried him over here and placed him next to the elven woman. He wanted to order his accomplice to carry the last person over here, but before that could happen he noticed a new mana signature. Someone was clearly activating a spell or a magical item. The man's class was an Abyssal Warlock, a prestige class that needed some special steps to unlock. He was someone that was proficient in transformation magic. He could transform his body into many abyssal monstrosities. He was also someone that started just like every other magic caster, as a tier 1 mage. He possessed all the magic-related skills and traits. He had noticed the shift in mana around Roland's body, but it was already too late. He had believed in the artifact, it had never failed him before. Even this tier 3 elven woman and gnome had fallen to its might. Only people with specialized classes that were resistant against abyssal illusion magic would be able to resist it. The youth that was there didn't fit the criteria. He didn't even have a tier 2 class. Yet somehow there he was, pointing a piece of metal at the artifact that this man was so proud of. The Abyssal Warlock's eyes glowed in a red color and he pointed his large tentacle at the magical device. He was trying to defend it. What the youth was planning was clear. The thick tentacle flew to block the path of the fiery arrow, but it was too late. The mass of fire elemental energy slammed into the double helix-shaped item. The artifact wasn't built with defensive measures in mind, so it shattered into many tiny pieces along with the table that it was on. "No!" The man wailed in a strange deep voice as he watched his artifact being destroyed. The woman that was with him was already next to the perpetrator. She had vanished from her spot and instantly appeared with her dagger above him, ready to deliver a killing blow. Without giving him much time to react, Roland turtled up. Right after firing the fire arrow spell, he instantly activated every protective item on his person. He had many magic shield-type runic spell scrolls on himself just for such an occasion. His body was covered by various elemental shields: fire, wind, water, and earth. He was encased in many layers of common-grade magical shields. The woman didn't falter with her attack. Her face showed a ghastly wide grin. The dagger flew down and started going through the protective barriers like through butter. Only after passing the fourth one did it start slowing down. Roland continued activating more shields in hopes of stalling her. His true objective wasn't to defend himself from this attack, it was to give the people in this room time to react. The biggest problem was that he didn't know how long that would take. He was putting his life in others' hands yet again. He had a theory that Zuliana wasn't just a simple shop clerk. She stuck too close to this gnome and he never saw any bodyguards around. Either the gnome was strong himself or this woman was the one defending him. His theory would be now put to the test and he really hoped that he was right. The last barrier finally shattered and the dagger poked through. It went right into his shoulder as he was given enough time to shift himself to the side. The pain was excruciating, he couldn't help himself from screaming. The woman's eyes turned into two crescent moons and it looked like she was enjoying herself. "Naughty boy," she said while twisting the dagger that had cleanly penetrated through Roland's scapula bone. It had even reached the floor behind it. A myriad of notifications sounded out. His HP had dropped by a third just from this one hit and if he looked he would see it ticking down continuously. The weapon the woman was using was clearly meant for killing. Even if she didn't finish the job, the poison and curse status would probably be his undoing. Luckily, due to the woman's nature, he wasn't quite dead yet. She wasn't like the abyssal warlock who did his killing proficiently. No, she on the other hand liked to toy with her targets. Naughty children need to be punished. She yanked out the blade from Roland's shoulder and aimed it for the other one. Now that she had the chance, she would play with her prey. The warlock had also momentarily spaced out. The shock of losing a holy artifact, a symbol of his faith, wasn't something that could be easily forgotten. But, it was gone and the targets hadn't been eliminated yet. "Kill him now. We can't waste time," he shouted while turning his tentacle towards one of the bodies on the ground. To his dismay, both of them were missing. He quickly looked around, his skin shifting color as he got ready to receive an attack. Then he heard it, the voice of his accomplice shouting. He turned his head to the door where the youth that destroyed his magical artifact was. His partner in crime had been attacked from behind. She was too focused on the boy to react fully. She now had a large gash on her side, obsidian-colored blood coming out of it while she backed away. "You bitch!" The warlock heard her shout but turned to another location. He had his own problem to combat. The gnome he was here to kill was now missing. It was as if he vanished, but he clearly wasn't someone versed in teleportation magic. Even if the boy and that elven woman survived, it wasn't a problem, but if the gnome got away they would fail their mission. The man quickly activated various detection skills and spells that he knew. To no avail. This wasn't his forte, he was more of a fighter. The gnome had to be here, he was probably using some kind of skill or item to hide his presence. The man moved his hands forward, tentacles shooting out and splitting into many smaller ones. They looked like long whips with pointy claws at the ends. If he couldn't see him, he would destroy this entire room and the whole building with it. Roland at this time was coughing up blood on the floor. Zuliana had swooped in for the save at the last moment, but he was having a hard time staying awake. The moment the dagger was pulled out, the paralyzation effect subsided, but the curse and poison status didn't. He did the only thing that he could and started crawling down the corridor, a trail of his blood following him. He heard two women shouting profanities behind him and strange whip-like noises. His plan of waking up Zuliana and the gnome had worked, but he still got stabbed. He needed to get an antidote and find a priest to remove this curse, if not he would die. He had some healing potions in his own bag, but the lesser antidotes weren't working. Luckily this was a shop owned by an alchemist, there were more powerful potions downstairs. He managed to crawl up to the stairs. Even while drinking his potions constantly, his health was still going down. His legs felt like they were made from lead as he slowly wobbled down the stairs, almost falling down at the last step. He stumbled and ravaged through the glass cases. There were various potions out behind this glass so that the customers could look over them. He didn't care if he would need to pay for it later, he needed to survive first. When his health was at about 20%, he finally got to the antidote section of the store. He tried bashing the glass open, but his attack bounced right off. Fuck. He backed away and took out his wand. This glass wasn't something that would easily break. He had forgotten this fact while panicking downstairs. He needed a key to get there, but he didn't think that he would find it. He pointed at the case with the potions in them and a fire arrow spell rushed forth. It collided with the glass but didn't shatter it. Roland continued pelting his target with his spells while his health continuously ticked down. The steel paddle wasn't designed to take this much mana and the metal started heating up. He bit his bottom lip and continued. Finally, after the 6th try, he had managed to melt a hand-sized hole through the partially magic-resistant glass. He frantically lunged forward and grabbed one of the higher-grade antidotes. The purple-colored liquid made its way into his mouth. Following this, he swallowed another healing potion before collapsing to the ground. He slumped back while looking at his status screen. He could barely make out the numbers, but his decreasing health started to slow down. He didn't have much time to rest though. A large number of tendrils burst through the ceiling and started wreaking havoc on the level he was on. The whole building started shaking as the battle upstairs continued. "I need to get out of here." His shoulder didn't stop hurting and his knees felt weak. He had gotten over the poison part and the bleeding was slowly stopping thanks to all the healing potions he had drunk. The only problem was that the wound was starting to take on a black coloring. The curse still remained and he needed to either find himself a priest or a blessed elixir. Curses like this one varied and most of the time worked at a slower rate compared to poisons. They could cause various effects like dementia and madness to boot. He started walking towards the exit while at the same time trying not to get impaled on the tentacle whips. It looked like the warlock above was really going after the gnome. The continued tentacle strikes indicated that he was proving to be a hard target to hit. Roland finally reached the door outside and tumbled down to the ground as his legs gave out. He clutched his injured shoulder that was still hurting and looked at the store. It looked like a horror show. There were massive squiggly tentacles bursting out through the walls everywhere. Monstrous screams filled the surroundings and made his whole body shiver in fright. The whole building was coming down. He could only watch and hope that the people inside would be all right. The screaming and shouting finally brought the city guards over. They were a lot faster this time around compared to when he got his old workshop invaded. Probably because this was a better part of the city. They were just in time to behold the abyssal warlock in all his glory. The person bursts out through the ceiling without looking like anything human. He had a vaguely humanoid shape, his hands had turned to claws and his shoulders were bulky. On those shoulders were massive eyes that blinked and twitched in every direction. To Roland's surprise, the man wasn't chasing after Zilyana or the manager. There was someone similar, a moon elf male battling this gruesome monster. The two left a partially collapsed building and their battle continued outside. He couldn't see Zilyana and the other woman anywhere. If they were battling in the shadows someplace else or were still in the building was a mystery. The guards surrounded the area and even more, people started appearing. The company probably had some backup henchmen for such an occasion. Roland just felt like a deflated balloon. He felt the adrenaline leaving his body, which made it hard to stay awake. He had somehow survived this, but he was left with a bad taste in his mouth. He felt like if he was stronger this wouldn't have been the case. There was one big thing on his mind now. "I need to leave this city." He had been involved in 2 assassination attempts now. None of them were directly his fault, they were all squabbles between other people. This was unacceptable. The lack of control over his own life was pushing him in a certain direction. He needed personal strength. He didn't think that he could depend on others anymore. Luckily, this was a clear breach of contract. The company had failed to protect him and this wound was proof. Where he would be heading was still up for consideration, but he had a couple of cities in mind. All of them, ones with dungeons and new opportunities. First, he needed to get this curse in check. The veins on his neck were turning black just like this wound. He was in dire need of a high priest. Chapter 53 Packing Up. Roland was now looking at an old man in a robe. The man had placed his hand on a dark-looking shoulder. This was the stab wound that Roland had suffered tonight. There were abscesses with yellow pus that had formed and some of those yellow juices were even flowing out. The smell of it all would be truly something that Roland would remember. This was inside the Temple of Solaria and he was just getting his treatment for the curse. The worst part about this wasn't the pain from being cursed but the sheer number of gold coins he had to pay to get this fixed. If he hadn't been saving up for the past year and a half, he would probably have to cut his arm along with his shoulder to survive instead. The old man was a tier 3 high priest, and the treatment required Roland to fork over 9 small golden coins. Normally he would need months of crafting and making runic equipment to get this back. Luckily he still was a part of a big company and would have them cover the costs. He also planned on getting a severance package as they had failed to keep their part of the contract. He had specifically fought for adding a clause to his contract. It stated that he would get money if he ever got injured due to them ever again. This included him being collateral damage during an assassination attempt. The gnome probably only agreed to such a clause as the possibility of that becoming reality was meager. Reality was different though. The company was attacked. He would now receive a large influx of gold coins and would be able to break off the contract entirely. This was something that he was planning to do as he had enough of this city. This was the second time this had happened. First was the incident with the Thieves Guild, and now some strange cult was after him. From the small amount of information that he had, he knew that this was some kind of assassination organization or guild. This guild of assassins were worshippers of some kind of demon or of an evil god. People were not sure who the being they were worshipping was. Whenever a warlock of any kind was involved, it meant that some kind of higher being was behind it. Warlocks would gain their special class by forming pacts with demons or evil gods. The one that he saw that night was quite the powerful one. He was versed in shape-shifting magic and could take on a form of some kind of deformed monstrosity. Relax, child, it is almost over. He could see his flesh giving out black smoke. This was the curse leaving his body that slowly returned to its original shape. If he didn't get this treatment, the priest told him that he wouldn't last till the next day. He would be turned into some kind of monster in the process and lose all of his reasoning. I hope that gnome didn't just die. I still need to get my money from him. Roland gritted his teeth while thinking. He had lost sight of the other people involved in this incident and he wasn't sure where they went. He had a written contract and this was a big company. If his old boss was dead, he would probably be able to get his money at a different company store. The old priest was finally finished with the treatment. Roland was still astonished by how healing magic worked. A person's wounds would just patch themselves up. He could even see the process of the healthy tissues forming in real time. It was as if time was wound back to the previous healthy form. Roland didn't know how healing magic was exactly different from regular magic. During the procedure, he tried activating various skills that he had, like his mana sense and debugging. There were no runes involved, so he couldn't copy it onto a diagram. The priest was still using mana to fuel the spell, so maybe it would be possible to emulate these spells in the future. For now, he removed himself from the temple of the sun goddess. While going through it, he could see some other injured people getting treated. The fight didn't end just with the destruction of Exeter's magic emporium. The unidentified assassins moved into the city and started battling with other high-level people. One of them was Zilyana, but there were others which Roland wasn't acquainted with. This in turn caused a lot of collateral damage. The horrible-looking shape-shifting warlock was quite indiscriminate in his attacks. The battle continued throughout the night and the two assailants were never apprehended. Roland managed to get his tired body to the temple before passing out. He was lucky enough to have brought money with him and they were very eager to take it off him while calling for a high priest. On the outside, he was greeted with some sunny weather. The clouds had parted and the day was looking bright. It was still quite cold though, and the sun did nothing about melting the white snow that covered most of the city. Roland decided to walk towards Exeter's magic emporium, or at least what was left of it. On his way there he could see collateral damage. Some of the buildings in the neighborhood had suffered during the scuffle that ensued. He could even see some red spots in the snow the closer he got to ground zero. After he arrived, he noticed that there were a lot of people around the store. They looked like battle-hardened soldiers, but they weren't part of the city guards. These people were part of the company. They were a bunch of mercenaries contracted as hired muscle. Obviously, they were a bit late to the party as the battle was now over. Maybe if more of them were here the night before, the store wouldn't have been destroyed this much. though the tier 3 magical device that was used would probably render them useless. He was fortunate enough that his debugging skill worked on the greater runes and he was able to get out of the world of illusions. Halt, identify yourself. As Roland was getting closer, he got the attention of one of the guards there. They had even fenced the area off with a makeshift wooden fence. He looked at the man. He was quite tall, over 2 m, and was of the Goliath race. Before he could mention his affiliation with the company, someone else called out from the side. "It's fine, let him through." It was Zilyana, who looked different than usual. Mostly because she didn't look like a sun elf anymore, her skin was dark caramel and her hair changed from gold to silver. There was no rule against moon elves in this city, but they weren't on good terms with the Church of Solaria as they worshipped opposing deities. She was wearing some kind of black leather armor and had some weapons strapped to the side. She looked battle-ready. He didn't see any wounds on her body. She went against those 2 psychos from yesterday, which made Roland reaffirm his notion about her hidden strength. The large man just nodded and didn't question the elven woman's order. Apparently, the beautiful elf was someone in high regard to these company soldiers. "This place has seen better days." He moved over to Zilyana while commenting on the store's new looks. The top floor was missing chunks out of it and the whole building was riddled with holes. The Abyssal Warlock had really renovated the place during the late-night melee. "Well, you seem chipper for someone that almost died." Roland. "Not even surprised about my new looks?" the elven woman mentioned while chuckling. "Why would I be surprised about that? Also, I'll be more chipper after you give me back the money I've spent on that blasted high priest." Roland was unamused. He narrowed his eyes at the moon elf. Zilyana just shrugged while turning her head to the side. She did feel kind of bad about the whole predicament. "Ah, I'm sure the boss will give you back the coins. You did save his ass and mine. I bet he will even give you a big fat bonus." The elf tried shifting the conversation to the monetary aspect. She knew that she was mostly to blame for that fiasco that happened yesterday. She had failed spectacularly as a bodyguard. If the boy hadn't been there, she and the manager would have been dead without a question. She didn't even see anything wrong in the illusion world. Zilyana had been affected by the magical device first after she opened the door to the gnome's office. Her mind was unable to paste it together and the manager in the illusion just shooed her out of his room. The whole illusion world then broke down after a few hours when Roland destroyed the runic device. She found herself on the ground with a small headache. Only after that did she realize what occurred and that enemies were nearby. Her boss had activated one of his magical items and went into hiding while she engaged the assailants in battle. Her co-workers like Zirian were alerted by her boss with a sort of panic button device that was there. The rest was now history. "Ha, you think a bonus is enough?" Roland clicked his tongue, but he stopped himself. He didn't really wish to argue with this woman that could probably cut him up into thin slices in a matter of seconds. She was also just a guard, and without her, he would have been dead. "That doesn't matter. Where is that gnome anyway?" He looked around. He could see that besides the group of guards there were other people here. He could even see his own halfling assistant moving stuff around. They were clearly carrying the goods outside. Maybe they were even planning on relocating somewhere else. "The boss? Oh, he isn't here. He should be back at his mansion, probably calling the big boss himself." "Ha, you should have seen him last night. He was ready to blow a gasket. Have never seen so many veins on someone's forehead before." Roland eyed the moon elf while raising one of his eyebrows. She didn't look that distraught after facing off against a tentacle monster and a crazy cursed dagger-wielding assassin woman. It was as if she was used to things like this, though judging by the fact that she was uninjured, this might have indeed just been the usual for her. "Back at his mansion?" "Yeah, it's in Hightown." Zilyana explained in a few words where exactly the gnome manager lived. Roland now had a place to go and complain. Before that he needed to get back to his workshop as he left his contract and some other things back there. "I bet he will give you a big pay raise. You did save his ass." She gave him some reassuring words while Roland just stared at her without any emotions in his eyes. Yeah, I should probably ask him to give me part of your salary. Roland said while turning around. He didn't care about getting any raises in his wages. The only thing he wanted to do now was to get the promised severance package. Though maybe if he complained enough he could get even more than that. Zelyanna flinched at the mention of her pay getting cut. She started waving her hands around at Roland that had turned around. No, don't do that. Hey, this big sis here saved your life. I really need that money. I saved your life first. Roland said while waving goodbye to her without turning around. He couldn't see the moon elf's expression too much, but not like he cared that much. He was quite pissed that he had gotten involved in some quarrel between two overpowered factions. He had come to this city to get away from the bloodshed. He just wanted to be left in peace and practice his craft. He hadn't even gone out to kill monsters in over a year. The only fighting he did was some sparring here and there. Roland now thought that he had been too naive. There was no way someone like him could make it on his own like this. It didn't matter if a person could earn money. What was that good for if anyone could just waltz into your home and murder you? Even the gnome that was loaded and had an experienced bodyguard couldn't protect himself. I need strength. He stopped in front of his workshop while thinking. He had already made a decision on leaving this city. In his mind, personal power would be the way to go. He wouldn't be able to achieve this here. He needed to take things into his own hands and get stronger. He opened up the door to his workshop. Before that he deactivated some of the runic traps he had set up. The doors and windows were now rigged to electrocute anyone that tried getting in here without him around. Roland had figured out ways to activate and deactivate some of the runes made for traps. He could even directly inscribe them on things like metallic doors. He was even thinking of improving on the designs with the sockets and mana stones. For now, they only had one charge, but with a mana stone that filtered and stored some of that mana, they could recharge themselves. He looked through his workshop. It was a place that he stayed for over a year. Again, he would be unable to live in one place for long. He lasted a couple of years in this city, but the easy life was now over. He needed to set out into the world and get stronger, only then would he feel confident enough to settle down. The biggest problem was his class and how it worked. He could see himself doing fine against monsters, but at a price. His class only shined when he was using runic equipment, and that wouldn't last forever. He already knew that steel weapons and armor wouldn't hold much of the runic charges. He could get around that by repairing it, but that required a place to do it. This meant that he needed to find a new workshop, buy new equipment along with finding a dungeon to gain more experience. For now, he went to his bedroom and lifted up his bed. He poked the floor slightly and it began to shine. The ground rippled for a moment before showing a compartment. He had placed a chest with some of his belongings behind an illusion rune. This rune caused most people to see a regular floor without showing the hidden latch under the bed. He pulled out the chest. In it were some spatial bags with gold and materials. In one of them was also the contract that he made with Exier's manager. It stated that he would be given money depending on the severity of the attack. Bet that gnome didn't think that this would ever be used against him. The number he would be getting is 100 small gold coins or 10 regular-sized gold coins. This was quite a staggering number. This would lead a regular family life for over 5 years. That is if they didn't spend it on anything other than taxes and food. For him that needed to buy costly crafting materials and a working workshop, it wasn't that much. He took out everything that he needed and started to even place all of the tools that he used from the smithy into his bags of holding. He even tossed the anvil inside, but would be leaving the smelter there as it was connected to the wall. Roland wished that he could just toss his entire workshop into his bag and just go, but that would be a pipe dream. He heard there were magical devices that could support a small pocket dimension. The cost of something like that would be what a country like this earns in a year or more. The easier option was creating a hidden workshop somewhere and placing a teleportation runic array in it. Things like this existed in the magic towers that powerful mages used and were a lot cheaper to manufacture. Still, he would probably need to wait till he was at least tier 3 for something like that. He had stuffed all of the items he could take into his bags and had them all around his belt. He couldn't put spatial bags in one another as the magics in them repelled each other. He took one last glance at the place that he lived and gave out a sigh. Roland didn't want to leave, but he didn't see a good reason to stay here. He took out a map of the whole kingdom and glanced at it. He had marked a couple of places that fit his requirements. They were all close to a dungeon and were growing cities with a lot of opportunities. He had researched them by things like taxation, population, and even by what noble was running it. He couldn't go into any lands owned by his own family or to people that his family was serving. This only left a couple of places for him. He would need to decide on them after his talk with the manager. He placed his coat back on and didn't bother to activate the trap runes in the building. He wouldn't be returning here anymore. Chapter 54, Getting the Name. A tall youth was walking towards a certain destination. He was wearing a long coat and hiding a lot of spatial bags that were hanging around his belt. He glanced around the city that he had spent years in and was getting slightly nostalgic. This was the city where his blacksmithing career took off. He had learned all the basics here and he did it on his own. It was also where he finally learned to use and create runes. After all these years, Roland was feeling like he was finally getting how they actually worked. He could even combine various schematics to create new spells. He would now need to postpone his future research and get out of this city. It was getting too dangerous and he didn't trust the company to protect him. If he didn't have his debugging skills, he would have died along with them. From his point of view, Zilyana had failed miraculously by not reacting in the correct way. The manager was at fault too for not getting some enchanted devices that could block out illusion magic of that caliber. It looked like they got lazy after years of stability. The business was booming and everyone was earning money. Then someone decided that it was time for a change by killing almost all of the council members. The whole city was now in disarray. Almost all of the businesses lost their owners in one day. The person that caused this would probably show themselves now. Who was doing it was a mystery, but they were probably doing it to get the biggest market share in the city. With the council heads gone, there would be a big hole in the city's finances. The perpetrator could be the sole survivor that hadn't been attacked during the meeting. The gnome was proven innocent as he had almost kicked the bucket. The next option was that it was a third party either moving in to take over or doing it for another reason. There were cult members involved in this assassination, and where they were, demons weren't far off. The man was an abyssal warlock, a person that made a contract with a higher being. Most of the time this would be achieved by selling their soul or by performing some kind of ritual. In this ritual, other people's lives would be used as payment. The woman that was with him was similar. She was an abyssal class holder but closer to the rouge route. She seemed to have a screw loose, which he noticed during the time that she stabbed him through the shoulder. Roland continued walking while trying to figure out the true perpetrator. The reason for this attack seemed obvious as a lot of money was involved. He wanted to know the reason for getting almost killed. Maybe the manager would have this answer. This whole predicament reminded him about the first city he had to leave. There he also left at a moment's notice, with his only plan being a city with crafting resources. He then stumbled around with some leftover cash for half a year before finally having some luck in selling his runic scrolls at the auction house. A city with an auction house is a must. He already knew that his scrolls would sell, be it at a regular store or an auction house. Without an establishment as that, he would probably need to sign another contract. This was something that he wanted to avoid this time around. He didn't think he would get a good deal without revealing his special class either. Trusting someone to keep it a secret again was something that he wasn't willing to do. Roland had a map with some notes. There were a couple of cities that he had researched, some larger than others. He wanted one that met some criteria. One was having an auction house where he could buy and sell items. The other thing that needed to be there was a dungeon. This was the most important requirement. Roland realized that having personal strength was paramount in this world. He just needed to look at the two assassins. They could just enter the city, kill people, and then get away without anyone being able to stop them. This was the strength of a Tier 3 elite, something that wasn't often seen in this world he was in. Most people that had battle classes ended their journey at Tier 2. Crafting professions could go higher as it was easier to constantly produce items than to constantly fight monsters. The raw stats a crafting profession had were also lower. The lack of battle skills was another minus for said crafting classes. With lower stats received and fewer skills, they wouldn't even be able to defeat a Tier 2 veteran. You could see this mostly by looking at Roland's scribe class that didn't give much besides intelligence and dexterity. The other physical stats were almost non-existent and it hardly increased his vitality. This was the case with most of the crafting professions besides a blacksmith. That was a class that actually required high strength and endurance to produce items. Yet someone like a leather worker or goldsmith wouldn't get much besides dexterity and then meager numbers in the rest. Roland felt like he needed to increase all of his battle-related skills before his advancement into Tier 2. Luckily his runic blacksmith class increased his battle-related stats. Though they looked to be stats for a stationary tank with high magic usage. High strength, endurance, and willpower but with low agility. Roland felt like he would have to either mitigate his weakness with some enchanted gear or strengthen the things he was good at. So either increase his agility with some mana stones or focus on his defenses and magic power. This he would decide after seeing his Tier 2 class options. He knew that there were some hybrid classes out there but if he could nab one was unknown. Dungeon, auction house, relatively new city would be nice if I could get some cheap real estate there. Another thing that he needed was a place to stay. He couldn't just live in an inn again as the need for repairing and crafting new equipment would be there. His class was reliant on it and he didn't think switching to a more battle-oriented one would give him as much flexibility. He would still need to make that decision after caping out his blacksmith class. Roland didn't think that he would be able to research information about the land he could buy here. Not like he could pull up an internet page with the information, the most he could do was to pay an information guild that sold things like that. The info wouldn't be fresh though and when he arrived the house could be already sold. He would probably have to risk the journey and hope for the best. Maybe I should try going someplace owned by the aristocrats instead of the royalists this time around. Roland thought as he was close to arriving in Hightown where the manager lived. There were two main factions in this kingdom, the aristocrats and the royalists. The former consisted of the most influential nobles of the country. The latter were part of the royal family mostly related to the king and the nobles sworn to them. There were also many smaller factions sprinkled here and there but they didn't possess as much power. These two factions were more or less close in power with the royal family winning out slightly. Roland was someone from a noble house himself. He had studied the basics of how this country worked. His own house of Arden was part of the royalists. His father had recently achieved the title of Baron after a successful campaign against one of the countries that his kingdom had less than stellar relationships with. The city of Edelgard was further into the country and closer to the royalists. The owner of it wasn't directly connected to his father but maybe the other faction ran their cities better. The noble that was responsible here certainly didn't give a damn about his citizens. When the first assassination attempt happened the guards were really late to arrive. He was also taken into custody without having the option of explaining himself. If I take all of that into consideration there is just one place I can go to. He looked at the map that he was holding and looked down at the south part of the kingdom. There was a certain large island there, it was ruled by a marquis that was part of the aristocrat faction. That wasn't the main reason for going there, there was a certain new dungeon that had risen recently. Things like new dungeons appeared from time to time. No one knew exactly how they came to be but each of those lairs had a dungeon core. People theorized that if the mana density was just right a dungeon core would come to be. This dungeon core could appear anywhere, down in a lake, buried deep underground, or even in the sky. Where the dungeon core appeared would mostly dictate how the dungeon looked and what kind of monsters appeared in it. This peculiar one that he was willing to risk going towards appeared in a volcanic region. The spot he would be going was rich in minerals, the monsters were fire types or rocky ones. The closest settlement to this dungeon was but a small village before this occurred. Now apparently people were flocking to it, quickly building up the infrastructure. If he hurried, he too could end up nabbing himself a part in this. Before that could happen, he needed to get out of here. For that, he also needed a lot of funds, and the broken contract that he was bringing with him would be for that. He finally stood in front of the gnome's supposed house. The number and street name was correct, so he went over and gave the door a couple of knocks. "Who is it?" The door didn't open, but he could hear a woman's voice behind it. Someone opened up a small latch through which they looked at him. "My name is Roland, I need to speak with the manager." Roland felt strange for not knowing the gnome's name after all these years. Was the small guy also trying to run away from his old life or something? Ah yes, wait a minute. The small latch closed and he could hear the locks being unlocked. The person on the other side revealed herself to him. The woman looked to be about 40 and a human. She was also wearing a maid uniform similar to the ones that the maids back at the Arden estate used to wear. "Please follow me, the master is expecting you." Roland nodded. At least the working staff weren't calling the gnome by his manager title. The house was quite large and reminded him of old Victorian-era brick houses. The inside was quite spacious and he could see other people working. There was a butler looking at some maids that were packing up some silverware. Obviously, the gnome wasn't going to stay here for much longer and they were packing up. When Roland arrived upstairs, he saw another moon elf in similar black leather clothing as Zilyana's. He was standing next to a partly opened door and he looked to be guarding it. "This is Mr. Roland, he wishes to see the master." Well, if it isn't the fabled master craftsman. When Roland got closer, he could see that something was wrong with this man. He looked quite relaxed and the odor of alcohol was quite strong. Fabled craftsman. He narrowed his eyes slightly. Did the gnome give out his secret to other people? That shouldn't be the case, as it was stated in the contract. There were other ways of getting information out. This was one more reason for him to leave this place. This again proved the limitations of contracts to him. "Mr. Zyron, you shouldn't bother the guest." The moon elf gave out a chuckle before pushing the door open. He peeked inside the room afterward and announced Roland's arrival. "Hey, you got a guest." Roland just remained there without saying anything. The moon elf had a strange grin plastered all over his face. "A guest? Who is it?" He heard a familiar voice from that room. The gnome sounded quite alive, but there was something off. "Master, Mr. Roland has come to see you." "Ah, let the boy in." When he peeked inside the room, he noticed what the problem was. The gnome was sitting in a chair and to the side were some crutches. He was missing his left foot, it was gone a bit below the knee. "Manager?" "Ah, this? That fucker got me good, don't worry about it, it can be healed later." "Wounds from warlocks like that don't heal that easily, I need to make a special elixir." The foot looked to be wrapped in some kind of strange bandages that had peculiar symbols on them. They didn't seem to be runes, but they were exuding some kind of mystical power. "Is that so? I see that you are packing up, skipping town?" Roland asked after closing the door behind him. He could see that most of the shelves in this room were cleared out and just a few scrolls remained here and there. "I underestimated that bastard." Roland quickly raised a brow and cut the gnome off before he could continue. "That bastard? There is no reason to hide it from you now." The gnome took out his old pipe and puffed out some smoke. "First, I have to thank you for saving my life. If you weren't there, I'd probably be coming out of that warlock's ass right about now." The gnome chuckled slightly while Roland cringed at the image that popped into his head. "About the man responsible, it's the second son of the Count. The bastard contacted the blasted abyssal cult. The idiot is crazy. He knew that the noble house that this land belonged to was the House of Drew, and the noble that resided here was called Louis Drew." "Louis Drew? Why would he aim for your life?" "I'm not sure, it was either just greed or another fight for succession. You know, Louis has an older brother, Armand. Armand is the true heir and this land is under his supervision, but he had to leave towards the border." The gnome gave him his best theory. Armand, the first son, had left for the border to aid in the war effort. There were some skirmishes the kingdom and the Hatfordian Empire were involved in, but they didn't escalate into a full-scale war yet. The idiot tried buying us out a couple of years ago, for an atrocious price. If he owned all the businesses in the city, he probably could somehow contend with his brother. Maybe he wanted to try buying his way back into his father's heart. The gnome blew out some of the smoke through his mouth again while grimacing. Unfortunately, we won't be able to pin this on him. Those abyssal cult bastards got away. Even if we caught them, they wouldn't talk, they would just commit suicide. Roland had to take a second to process this. Apparently, he had gotten himself into the middle of some petty squabble between two noble sons. While one was away, the other was trying to buy out the city from under him. When the other came back, he would actually own all of the money-making businesses. Roland wasn't really sure about the laws around here, but even nobles couldn't just take over stores without getting the right papers from the current owners. Even they couldn't go against the law of the land and needed to have the owners sell their property. The only way to go around this was if the owner died without an heir. Then the noble would get ownership of whatever that person owned. The noble, by killing the current owners, wanted to get the stores for free. That or get them from their next of kin that would probably sell it instantly after seeing their deaths. The abyssal cult's involvement would have been difficult to prove. Even though everyone knew who the perpetrator was, with no hard proof, it would be impossible to pin something on a noble. Don't worry, kid, you can come with me. I'll be leaving towards the capital. I'll get you a nice workshop there. You did save my life. The gnome changed the subject after everything was clear. He and his people were leaving. Even though the assassination had failed, there was still danger. Most of the council was dead, and their business associates probably knew why. Everyone would either sell what they had or leave. The noble in question would probably get most of the establishments. If that was enough for him to take this city over before his brother returned was unknown. Yes, about that. Roland didn't beat around the bush for much longer. He got his answer to his question and now knew that nobles were involved. He quickly pulled out his contract and placed it on the table before speaking out. I will be leaving, but not with you. Now give me my money. You broke the contract. The gnome blew out some smoke through his nostrils and looked at the piece of parchment. He didn't look that surprised. I thought so. You sure you won't reconsider? You'll need a better workshop in the future. This is something I can provide you with. The capital is a lot safer than wherever you are planning to go. You should think it over again. Roland just shook his head while declining the gnome's offer. Having a workshop was fine and all, but hanging around people that attracted tier 3 monsters left and right was too stressful. I thought about it, but I'd rather try things my way. The gnome pointed to the side with his pipe. On one shelf there was a loan bag and next to it a book. Figured you'd say that. The money is in there with a little bonus for your troubles. Should cover the healing fees. Roland moved over and looked inside the bag. He was greeted by quite a bit of golden coins. 150 small gold coins to be exact, and next to the bag was a book. This was a skill book and had the mana reinforcement skill knowledge in it. He had asked the company to procure it before this whole fiasco happened. 150, that's 50 above the contract sum in this book. Just take it, most of it came out of Zilyana's and that idiot's pay. The gnome grumbled while Roland placed the gold pouch into one of his spatial bags along with the skill book. So, don't think you'll tell me where you are headed. Roland just blankly stared at the gnome as if that was a stupid question to ask. He didn't really have a deep connection with this man, but he did at least pay him well. I'd rather not. I don't know what you are running away from, kid, but take care of yourself. If you're ever in the capital, be sure to find me. I'll give you a good deal. Just say that Marlowe Grimboodle sent ye. Marlowe. Roland looked at the gnome that was smiling. His pipe was placed to the side while he grasped one of his crutches. The one and only. Don't be spreading my name to just anyone. Roland finally had his money and had even gotten more than he anticipated. The only thing left now was to get to the train station. This journey would take longer than before, as he would be traveling a lot farther than last time. Maybe if he got stronger he might take Marlowe up on his offer. Chapter 55, Setting Out Again. A tall youth with dark hair and a somewhat handsome face was standing at a travel agency. He was looking at a map on which he scribbled some notes. This was Roland that had just gotten the information that he required to reach his next destination. This would be the next place that he would be staying at. Third time's the charm, he muttered to himself while walking towards the train station. He would be traveling even longer than he was before, and he would even have to take a boat. His destination was the large island in the south of the Cauldries Kingdom. The large mass of land was called the Dragnus Island. It had a large volcano right in the middle of it and a couple of smaller ones sprinkled here and there. The name of the island wasn't just for show, there apparently was a dragon living there. It wasn't roaming the lands and burning the villages though. It was the last boss of the dungeon that resided there. This was the main dungeon of this island and its rating was an S. There were various other smaller dungeons sprinkled around the entire landmass. Due to the peculiar way that the main dungeon was placed, it was said that the smaller ones connected to it. The one he was going towards had formed a couple of months ago and was still getting its rating. Contrary to popular belief, Dragnus Island wasn't a wasteland. It was true that the center part was mostly uninhabitable and overrun by monsters. The coastline in comparison was covered by lush greenery and the climate was quite warm. There were also various safety measures that were put in place. One of them was the Magus Towers. They were 5 large ones surrounding the main volcano. They formed a magical barrier that kept the monsters at bay. It also protected the rest of the land from volcanic ash and from surprise volcanic discharges. At least that was what the lady that worked at this world's version of a traveling agency said. The people in charge there were probably trying to attract more people. It was a land of opportunities for sure, but at the same time, it was dangerous. This whole kingdom was a dangerous place. Even in this large city, people that were part of strong factions like the council weren't safe. There was no guarantee that you wouldn't be stabbed in the back. Here we had a feud between 2 noble sons. The younger one wanted to take over the city's money-making facilities before his brother returned. If that didn't work, the deaths of 6 of the council members would cause this city to turn chaotic. He would be blamed for it as the acting regent, but the older brother would also be blamed as he was the true heir. I wonder if those 3 idiots are going to do similar things when they are older. Roland was also from a noble house. One not as established as the Drew house that had a count as the leader. There would be only one heir to the estate. Would the other 2 sons just let the oldest get everything while they went away to be knights for other nobles? Or would the heir bribe them with promises of cushy positions at his estate? Roland just shrugged. He was glad that he wasn't involved in those power struggles anymore. Even if he told them that he had no interest in the title or land, his brothers could still go after him. He really didn't want to get into a war of succession. A baron title wasn't even worth that much. He could probably even earn more money as a runesmith. In this kingdom, there was a strict hierarchy. A knight was the lowest noble ranking, they were more or less just commanders for the army. Following that was the baron title that his father had, just a step up. This was the true beginning of the noble ladder. A baron was granted land and subjects to rule, but the land they got was mostly smaller villages. After that came the viscount title, then the count, followed by the marquis. The higher the title, the more land and more subjects the noble was granted. The highest title a noble not related to the royal family could possess was the ducal title. Nobles with the title of a duke were the leaders of the aristocratic faction, and there weren't many of them around. There was also the archduke title, but it was reserved for the royal family. Mostly the brothers or sisters of the current king were allowed to call themselves that. Even with a grand title like that, it didn't mean that they were above the dukes. It all depended on how they managed their resources or how much the current king was willing to give them. The structure of the nobles was very archaic and convoluted. There was no trust between houses unless there was some kind of bonding contract like a marriage. Backstabbing each other was seen as a fun pastime in some of their circles. Roland would rather spend his life as a craftsman than be involved in that masquerade. For this, he needed more power, the power that he could only gain by risking his life. Gaining levels wasn't enough, Gaining stats with no practical combat experience made no sense. This would be similar to doing basic strength and stamina training at a martial arts school. Yet never doing any sparring with other students. A person would get stronger and learn techniques, but unless they tested it on a resisting opponent they would get nowhere. Roland was now back at a familiar place with a ticket in hand. It was time to take the train once more. He had done this before, so there was a lack of hesitation in his actions. He was even slightly tingling with anticipation. So long, Edelgard. Next stop, the town of Albrook. This was his next destination. A rather small town with a rather common uninteresting name. A few months ago a dungeon entrance had opened up and now people were flocking there. First, a new adventurers guild was getting built. With the dungeon now appearing there, a large revenue stream would be opened. Mana stones were just one of the things that could be harvested. There were apparently mineral deposits there which Roland as a blacksmith was very much interested in. He wanted to build a new workshop there, one that he could actually open up and sell things in. He wasn't sure when and how he would do that. He would probably require someone else to sell his wares if he was busy with the dungeon and adventuring. He would also need to trust a person he knew nothing about to just stay in his workshop for days and not steal anything. It was finally time to leave. The conductor blew his whistle to signal for the people to get on. Roland hesitated slightly, but he took the first step forward. The youth had grown quite a bit in these past years and it looked like he wasn't finished. He was wearing the usual black robe with which he could hide his face. He decided to now wear any metal armor over his cloth armor just yet. He didn't think the need for it inside the safety of this train, and it was too bulky for the ride. He would also stick out like a sore thumb if he went in fully armed. The armor of choice was the brigandine armor that was now resting in one of his storage bags. He did have some other items to cover some spots. Both his arms were covered by wrist guards and his legs were protected by greaves that were placed over his leather shoes. He didn't make these items himself, he just bought them from one of the shops. He did put some runic enchantments on them, but he didn't have time to add any slots for mana stones. Roland deliberated if he should go back to his workshop to enhance his armor, but he decided against it. Those people from the Abyssal cult had seen his face and could still be in this city. They were probably enraged that someone like him was the reason for their whole plan failing. This was some bad for the assassins. He needed to flee as he couldn't trust the people from Exeter to protect him. What if those cultist nuts returned with a stronger treasure and he just dies in the illusion? He was still probably a low priority target. The person who should really watch his back would be the gnome. This was also the reason why he was feeling slightly more relaxed with his journey. While thinking, Roland heard the conductor using his whistle again. The large train shook slightly before moving forward. He found a seat for himself by the window. It was quite crowded today, as probably after yesterday's attack other people had decided to also ditch this city. He wasn't feeling that nostalgic about it as he spent most of his time hidden away in a workshop. The only noticeable people that he met here were Marlowe, Halsey, and the gnome's elven assistant. There were also 3 other guys he met, but he hasn't seen them ever since that one expedition. His old fling was planning on going in the opposite direction to another well-established dungeon city. The gnome was heading for the capital city that housed his company's main building. Roland had become quite the loner after spending over 9 years in this world. He still couldn't really see himself as one of the people of these lands. He subconsciously evaded human interaction, which was leading him down this introverted path of solitude. He leaned back in his wooden seat and gave out a sigh. This train would take him through most of the kingdom, but then he would need to switch to a caravan. He needed to reach the closest port in the south to get to the volcanic island. This journey would be a lot longer than the last one. There were no magic trains that could go through water, and the ships were just regular sail ships. At least the one that he would be taking, due to not wanting to spend too much money. He didn't see one yet, but from the books, he read there were supposed to be ships that looked similar to old steam ships. Instead of steam, they ran on mana. He actually wanted to visit one and see the engine room. I have enough money to start over, but I should probably do it better this time around. Roland took out his adventurer card and to the name that was on it. He was thinking about ditching his old name and starting over. There were certain ways to alter the status of this card. The one that he wanted to be gone was his name. There were no computers keeping the exact stats of every adventurer in this world. There were only these adventurer cards that were updated with certain magical tools to show your status. From what he knew, if someone was searching for him, at most they could get information about him if they knew his card ID. The guild stored information about which adventurers passed through the city. This meant that if someone figured out the city this card was made, they could look for him. Someone with enough resources would need to go through the guilds one by one. Sooner or later they would find which cities he visited and could then narrow the search area. He wasn't worried about his family in this instance. He was worried about the abyssal cult that even had 2 tier 3 monsters out killing yesterday. They could probably sneak into the guild and steal the records if they really wanted. He grimaced after making a decision and ripped his adventurer card in half. The rest was tossed out the train window, never to be seen again. He would start over from the beginning. With the level he was at, he would be granted the Steel Adventurer title right from the start. He could also pay slightly extra to get his name on the card changed to a nickname. There shouldn't be a problem with his plan. Other adventurers did sometimes lose their identification and needed to start over. Most of the time they just returned to the place they received their old card and had it remade. But other times when the journey would just be too far, they would have them remade. People mostly gained their rank by status and not by their track record. A person with a tier 2 class wouldn't need to start over as a bronze adventurer. They just needed to get through a few tests and that was it. While Roland was on his way towards his new promised land, the castle in which the current city lord was living was abuzz. Louis Drew and the knight captain were both in his study while the noble in question was looking at some papers. They failed. Yes, my lord, but they managed to remove 6 of the council members. What of the other 2? The people from Exeter are on their guard. Our reports say they are leaving the city together with most of their assets. The other merchant has already fled. Louis Drew rubbed his chin while looking at the papers. A more in-depth report of what happened last night was here. How the people that he hired had murdered most of the council members and even left a calling card. Louis wasn't worried that others would associate him with the cult. There was no evidence and the messenger that he sent was long dead. The knight captain was the only other person that knew the truth, and he knew that the man wouldn't dare to go against him. Even though not all of the people he wanted gone were dead, he could go through with the next phase of his plan. He didn't fear the survivors as he was a noble with a lot of backing. He didn't think a bunch of commoners would dare to go against a count's son. There was no proof of his involvement with any of this besides the Thief Guild incident. Even if that came out to the light, they wouldn't be able to connect it back to the abyssal cult murders. Captain, have our people move along with the plan. Be persuasive if you have to give them the price we agreed upon previously. The man in the suit of armor did a salute and then promptly left the room. The count's son was now alone. He stood up. With short steps he walked over to the window and looked outside. It was already dark and the 2 bright moons were gently illuminating the darkness. While looking out into the distance he started murmuring to himself. I won't let you have this city, it belongs to me and no one else. If I can't have it, then I'd rather burn it to the ground. The man smirked while thinking about a certain older brother that would be returning soon. He only had a couple of months left, but it should be enough to replace the merchants with his own people. Controlling the money flow of the city was his way of taking it over. He needed to prepare so that everything was ready for his brother's return. He had suffered unforeseen setbacks through these years, but he didn't just spend them doing nothing. While he couldn't touch the council members for a year, there were others that he could affect. The abyssal cult was a small gamble that he was willing to take. With the help of their peculiar brand of magic, he had been slowly taking over this city. Replacing public officials by any means necessary. That meathead won't suspect anything, he was always like that, never using his head and thinking that everything will always go his way. The man took out a framed picture and looked at it. In it, there were 2 kids standing next to a man. The children were alike and had similar facial features to the adult. Louis Drew looked at this picture in disdain before setting it ablaze with his magical flames. The red embers that he was holding in his hand slowly turned pitch black as they turned the picture to cinders. The sound of cackles filling the emptiness of the room as the night continued. Chapter 56 Joining the Caravan. Roland's head hit the uneven window of the train he was riding on. His eyes were hurting as he couldn't sleep well in these kinds of conditions. With the addition of the stress of riding alone to an unfamiliar location, it only added to his sleeplessness. He had also spent 3 days riding this blasted train without being able to stretch his legs. The scenery continued changing while they journeyed deeper into the south part of the kingdom. The snow started to vanish with time and it turned to fields of grass. Roland noticed that this kingdom had strange climate cycles. One part of it could be covered in snow while another would have smoldering hot weather. This was mostly due to the effects of magic that affected the climate in odd ways. Thanks to this, the journey wasn't that chilly. This train didn't have anything like a central heating system. It was more or less just iron and wooden carts. Some of the windows let the cold air in if not closed correctly. Regrettably, this marvel of current engineering couldn't take him to his final destination. The time to depart came as he arrived at the last station. It was a large trade city similar to Edelgard. The trains like the one he was traveling on only stopped at these types of cities. They transported goods to specific parts of the kingdom where then they would be taken further by merchants in caravans. This was also the next part of his journey, finding a merchant caravan towards the port city. If I remember correctly, the city I'm supposed to go to is called Leyden. I'll have to pay and go as a tourist. Roland thought back to the moment he got rid of his adventurer card. If he still had it, he could probably just take an escort mission from the guild. Every caravan with merchants placed missions as that, and adventurers used them to mitigate travel expenses. The money they received for the job was slightly reduced. Instead, they got free food and even some carriages to ride in when they got tired. He didn't worry too much as he did have a hefty sum of money with him. This would even be a better way to travel as no one would expect him to risk his life to defend the caravan. If something went wrong, he could just escape while the adventurers and guards faced off against whatever was attacking them. They would be disposable meat shields that he could use to cover his escape. Roland hopped down from the train and looked at the surroundings. The train station was kind of similar to the one in Edelgard, but it looked to be in worse shape. He didn't see any people from the Church of Solaria like last time, so that was a bonus. Roland weighed the pros and cons of getting a new adventurer card in this city. He decided against it as this train had a direct link to the city he previously lived in. It would be possible to get his new ID from here if they followed the path. He needed to get a new one directly at Dragness Island. There had to be a guild at Albrook. That would be one of the first things to be built after a new dungeon appeared. While walking away from the train station, he felt something in his abdomen. It was the feeling of hunger. He had only taken simple rations that he didn't like that much. There was food to buy on the train, but it wasn't of high quality either. When he was a few hours away from this city, he decided to wait. He would rather not eat for a bit and get some freshly made stew here than eat more dried meat. The caravans take some time to gather. I might have to take a break in this town for a few days. Roland continued toward the city. It was the middle of the day, so the restaurants would still be open. Smaller cities didn't have those around that much, as the inns the adventurers lived in were used for such services. The quality of the food suffered when the locale was used for everything. After living in this world and having eaten bland food for so long, Roland was slowly getting fed up with it. He was even willing to pay a bit extra if he could get something savory. The buildings in this city were mostly constructed from red bricks. This was the main theme of the architecture in this kingdom, but the warmer the climate became, the more log cabins appeared. After living in this world for so long, Roland was able to distinguish between good and bad restaurants. How good the food would be could be mostly spotted by how well kept the building of the establishment was. Previously he just entered the closest one available and took whatever he could get. Now on the other time, he took some time to examine the outside and inside layouts before choosing. This one looks fine, shouldn't be too expensive either. He pushed the door open to a middle-sized restaurant building. The moment he entered he could smell the aroma of food which made his mouth water slightly. He could see some people on the inside, most of them looked to be regular commoners as they weren't wearing anything that an adventurer would wear. The biggest telltale sign of a bad restaurant was a large number of drunks. Rowdy adventurers also mostly visited the cheaper diners. Most of the hardened men that worked by killing monsters and fighting off bandits didn't care about good food that much. They would rather spend their days drinking and then visiting the red light district where they spent most of their money. In about half an hour his dishes were ready and he could finally eat. He used this chance to ask the staff about the location of the Adventurer Guild. Even without his adventurer card, that was the place to go if you wanted some information. People that formed caravans actually wanted more people to join them. They had enough room to transport people that would pay for the carriage. Some of them would even postpone the journey before all the free spots were filled out. This helped with paying for the adventurers that protected the caravan quite a bit. It was also quite cheap as the people mostly rode with the goods. Roland covered his mouth while burping and left some coins on the table along with a small tip. He wanted to take care of his business as soon as he could. He wouldn't want to be stuck wandering through the night searching for an inn to stay. Even with the general information where the guild was, it would take him some time to find his way. He didn't really want to spend money on a city map if he was just going to be leaving soon. Roland decided to use a coach to get around this problem. The streets were crude but the ride didn't hurt his posterior all that much. When he arrived he was greeted by a plain-looking adventurers guild in a large brick building. There was no dungeon in the immediate area here either, so the adventurer levels would probably be low. On the inside, it had a similar layout to all the guilds that he had seen before. The people who were running things here probably decided on keeping all the buildings the same. Which was smart as some adventurers weren't that intelligent. Keeping a familiar architecture to all the adventurer guilds probably saved a lot of time. This lowered the possibility of getting the adventurers confused when they traveled to different guilds. They would automatically know where to get everything if it was kept the same. There was the usual smell of sweat and alcohol and the same similar-looking bar in the back. He could see adventurers talking at the round tables. This brought back some old memories of his adventuring days. Roland started spacing out. Some of his old party members' figures superimposed themselves on similar-looking adventurers. The only thing that snapped him out of it was a person behind him. "You're blocking the door, move." Roland snapped back into reality and looked at a group of men. He didn't answer and just stepped to the side while the person that called him out just cussed at him while walking away. Am I missing the good old days? Roland asked himself while going towards the notice board. Would he find anyone pleasant to work with in the new city? There would probably be new adventurers flocking there to hit it big. He wasn't planning on taking a passive backline position though. He had seen firsthand how limited a mage class actually was. When someone at your level managed to close the distance, you were a sitting duck. He could try coming up with some defensive measures like the runic shield variants. Maybe ones that cause repelling forces or explosions. Magic's biggest drawback was the time it took to cast. Even with the runic variations, there was a slight delay. People only got faster and faster with each tier, their reaction times became superhuman. He needed to be able to react to opponents at close range. One way of doing that would be increasing his physical stats by training. He still needed to raise his weapon proficiencies to the max and could pick up some passive skills that gave some bonuses that he hadn't tried before. Another faster way would be by using his runesmithing class. He now knew how to insert mana stones into slots. These gems would increase his stats by a flat number. He could create an armor for himself that aided him in battle. He had a large mana pool and a skill that lowered his mana usage when using runic gear. If he added the mana stones on top of it all, he felt like he could match higher tier classes in pure stats. He just needed some time to prepare and the right materials. All of this would cost a lot of money. Luckily he had a good head start thanks to the broken contract. There is one caravan heading towards the port city. leaving in 2 days. He looked at the notice board and quickly found his next destination. He wouldn't even need to ask the guild receptionist for information. Everything was written down here, he just needed to go to the caravan meeting place and sign up directly with them. He had 2 days to rest and think about his next few moves. He also needed to do one thing that he wasn't able to during the train ride. Roland left the Adventurers Guild almost as fast as he came. His next target was an inn, he needed a place to stay. He managed to find some lodgings before the night took over and was now looking at a certain book. Mana Reinforcement. This was a skill book that he ordered before the unfortunate events took place in Edelgard. This was a special skill used by many classes and quite costly. Just as the name stated, it reinforced your mana and increased your mana pool in the process. Roland got to it and started reading. His high intelligence and advanced reading skill aided him in understanding it fast. There were certain hidden stat requirements for this skill and a special way of actually learning it. So that's how it is. He sat down on the wooden floor in his room while removing his robe. He needed to expose his skin to the ambient mana in the surrounding for this to work. Even after reading the whole skill book, he wouldn't be able to just get this skill instantly. He needed to correctly perform it, and only then would his status window get updated. His legs were now together and he moved his hands apart while resting them on his knees. This was called the lotus position and was mostly used by monk classes for meditation. Roland closed his eyes and focused on the invisible energy that was circulating around him. His basic mana sense skill aided him in getting this skill greatly. The ambient energy in the air started to slowly move towards his body. From the outside, it looked as if Roland's body exuded gentle blue light. This looked to be a rudimentary process of absorbing mana but was very dangerous in reality. The person needed to absorb the mana energy from the surroundings and inject it directly into their body. This was different from casting spells, as a mage just guided the mana outside after a short period of time. Here Roland needed to bathe his blood vessels and organs in this energy. If he failed, his body could burst from the inside. This was also the reason the previous owner of this body died. The boy absorbed mana too fast without having a strong base to resist it. With the knowledge from the skill book, it was a trivial task for someone like Roland. Through his crafting profession, he had learned to control his mana quite well. He took in a large breath and guided most of the mana into his lungs. Through them, he would distribute it to his red blood cells that would carry it through his whole circulatory system. It felt like he was doing a martial arts breathing exercise. Its purpose to bathe his whole body in mana and make it be more receptive to it. It was similar to how regular iron changed to deep iron when exposed to mana for long periods of time. You have learned basic mana reinforcement. After several breathing exercises, he finally heard the system voice speak out. He looked to his status and could see it now being there, at L1. This skill added a percentage of mana to your base stats. At L1 it only increased it by 1% all the way up to 9% when maxed out at the basic version. The good thing about this skill was that he didn't need to buy another skill book for the higher tier version. He would be able to automatically rank it up after reaching tier 2. From what he knew, the skill at tier 2 would go up to 25% and at tier 3 to 50%, which with his already high mana would net him a big chunk of usable mana for crafting. He didn't have much to do for now, so he decided to practice this skill throughout the rest of this and the following day. His stay in this city consisted of going to the restaurant and then practicing his mana reinforcement skill. With his current level and stats, it proved easy and he managed to get it to level 2 before the second day ended. On the dawn of the next day, he arrived at the place where the caravan would be leaving. He could see a lot of people gathered and over 20 carriages were there. They looked like long horse-drawn carriages, but the animals that were pulling them varied by species and size. Ones had large lizard-looking creatures, others had large bulls with 3 tails and 3 horns. Some did have horse-looking animals, but they were much bigger than the ones you would expect to see. These were mostly tamed monsters that had a lot more stamina than regular barnyard animals and could pull a lot more weight. Roland went over to the person that looked to be in charge. He was easy to spot as he had a clipboard in hand and was taking down notes. I'd like to travel with this caravan to the port town. The man looked to Roland. He was wearing his dark robe and the man could tell that the person had a robust build and was armored. You're not one of the adventurers? We are still missing a few. Roland explained that he wasn't part of them and that he wanted to ride in one of the carriages as just a traveler. The man with the clipboard nodded and then gave him the price for such luxury, which Roland paid down to the last copper coin. The exchange was now finalized and he could pick one of the carriages to travel in. In situations like this, it was mostly expected to just ride with the transported items. People were expected to just find a free spot themselves. He found himself one that had some space with a lot of wooden crates inside. He was able to lean against one of them with some leftover leg space. Now he just needed to wait for everyone to gather up and his journey would continue. If possible, he would continue training his new skill while riding in the cart. The trip would take about a week, so he had a lot of free time to practice. Chapter 57 Into the Mountains. Roland was one of the first new arrivals, but he wasn't the last. There were other people that wanted to travel in this large caravan gathering. Luckily, the cart he was using was stocked to the brim and most people came in larger groups. This saved him from having travel companions in the cart he chose. He was sitting at the back end of it, so he also didn't need to talk or look at the coachman. This was the perfect spot for someone like him that didn't really see the point of interacting with these people. While sitting and waiting, he glanced outside. He noticed some people gathering. He could see some of the adventurers arriving while wearing various types of armor. Roland was already someone that had dipped his toes in the blacksmithing profession. He could already spot some areas that were unkempt. Chinks in the armors, old leather belts that were about to snap, and even badly made runic weapons. He had a small itch behind his ear while glancing at the last category. He wanted to go grab some of those weapons and correct the runic structure. Such an act would give out his profession and he wanted to avoid that. After spending days on the train without working on any metal, he was feeling bored. He didn't think he would be missing rune crafting and smithing this much. In a world lacking anything that interested him that much and while having no hobbies, creating runic items was his only pastime. Other than the adventurers, he could see other travelers arriving. They all varied by looks, age, and even by their race. The caravan was slowly getting filled up with people and soon they would be leaving. Roland took note of how many people there were. This convoy of caravans was the largest he had been part of yet. There were even more people here than when he went on that expedition to the mines. Some of the people that were coming brought their own guards along, so there was some backup for the adventurers that only had slightly more than 10 people. By the gear they were using, it was easy to speculate what class they had. Most of them, as always, were holders of the warrior class. Most of them looked older, thus Roland believed that they should be at least tier 2. It was normal to be a tier 1 class if you were below 20 years of age, but just like him, some people leveled up faster. If he continued his old pace, he thought he would be at the L25 cap within the year. Now maybe even faster if he entered a dungeon and farmed some XP. After gathering enough information about his surroundings, Roland leaned back into his carriage. He wanted to practice his mana reinforcement skill while he traveled. He couldn't remove his clothes this time around to get more mana in. With monsters and strangers around, it would be unwise to remove his armor. His mana shield enchantments couldn't activate on their own quite yet. He wanted to develop a rune that would repel weapons and attacks on impact. He just needed to figure out the minimum requirement for it to activate. If he set it too low, it might activate while he was running, while when too high it would be useless. He had one technique that he wanted to try, but he needed more time to develop his crafting. He wanted to try placing the impact detecting components deeper into the metal. With this, when a sword pierced into it more than a millimeter, it would set off the defensive measure. It would also need to work with blunt force, like hits from maces. Bending the metal more than it should also set it off. The problem would be to not make it react to other outside forces like gravity. He couldn't have it activating if he jumped from a high spot and it turned on when he landed. With his increased stats, he could perform superhuman feats by this point. His strength was already above any grown man from his old world. It would be quite hard to develop something like that, but it would be a lifesaver if he got attacked from the back. For now, he only knew how to produce simple runes that activated on impact or on a timer. He could somewhat play around with their settings, but he didn't have full control over it. He was still limited to the hardware and could not affect the software yet. Wonder if it will be possible when I reach Tier 2. He rubbed his chin while thinking. The biggest drawback of his debugging skill was that he couldn't see inside the components. It was like looking at a motherboard. He could insert what parts he wanted but was limited to pre-made ones. He could keep replacing the processor and hard drives that he knew of, but he couldn't affect the software in them. When he achieved that step, only then he would feel like a true runesmith. While he was contemplating some new designs, he felt the carriage that he was sitting in jolt forward. They were finally setting off. He could see some people riding on horses and even large birds that looked like giant chickens. They were lankier and their legs had sharp claws than regular poultry. This journey would take at least a week, as they would be making a lot of stops along the way. This kingdom wasn't a safe place outside the large cities. There were monsters prowling everywhere, only shying away from large human gatherings. These monsters had their migration circles and some even set up their own territories. If they arrived in a new one, that some kind of goblin tribe established, battle was inevitable. They had a lot of adventurers with them as well as some guards. Roland felt that their group should be able to defend themselves during a fight. He was only a traveler and not affiliated with the guild for now, so he wouldn't even need to take part in the skirmishes. It was better to lay low. The abyssal cult could be following him now or later. If he stuck out too much, word would spread. There weren't that many mages around, and they clearly saw him using a fire arrow spell that time. Roland looked to his side where he had the weapon that he created. He could pretend that he was a mana warrior with it. With the addition of his blacksmith class, he should have enough strength to match others. His high intelligence would just make the magic attacks that came from this sword stronger. He heard the people talking and they finally moved forward. The carriage he was riding in was just a simple one, which meant that it would be a bumpy ride. Without going into the lotus position, he closed his eyes. His mana exercises continued as he needed to increase his mana pool. This was a bumpy ride, so concentrating on his new skill would prove a challenge. On the flip side, this would help him train his willpower and concentration. The trip continued through dirt roads. He could see the city he was in vanishing in the distance after a few hours. They drove through some villages on the way before coming in for a stop as the night dawned on them. Even though he didn't want to mingle with the others, he became quite hungry. The traders responsible for this expedition set up camp. The wagons were positioned in a circle around the campfire. They would act as cover if someone decided to attack them with ranged attacks. Roland grumbled slightly while moving his hood over his head. After a life filled with solitude, his linguistic skills started suffering. He had become more socially awkward after years of evading people and hiding from his family. Speaking out to strangers without a reason became harder. He slowly walked over to the campfire. An older lady was cooking something up and it smelled quite nice. When he got closer, his mouth started watering. The people were lining up, so he followed suit and placed himself at the end of the line. After leaving the confines of the large wagon that he secluded himself in, Roland was finally able to see who else was here. There was a mix of races, mostly ones that he had seen before, but most of them were humans like him. Nearly all of the people here were merchants and peddlers. Besides them, there were the adventurers and some armored guards. There also was a family with a baby, which caused him to stare. It was an unusual thing for someone like them to travel like this. Maybe they were also trying to find a better place to stay as he did. There was another odd thing that he noticed. Most of the guards were sticking close to a peculiar wagon. It was longer than the rest and he could see that it had some iron bars at the end. Was there some kind of animal in there that they were keeping from fleeing? He also noticed a peculiar symbol on this wagon. He remembered seeing it somewhere before. He strained his head and finally recalled where he had seen it. Slave traders. It dawned on him, he had seen people having that symbol burned into their skin. It was a triskelion symbol, which was a shape with threefold rotational symmetry. This one was circular in shape with 3 dots on the inside of the triskelion spirals. It was a universal slave symbol and was the calling card of slave traders. This world was one of war and strife. Things like slaves existed like any other things. There were various types of them, some of which were war slaves, criminal slaves, and debt slaves. Criminal slaves were people that were, as the name stated, criminals. There were mostly robbers, killers, and thieves. Depending on the severity of their crimes, they would be sentenced to a life of slavery. War slaves were mostly just prisoners of war. Captured soldiers would be taken in as slaves after losing a skirmish or a war. Even high-ranking nobles from another country could end up like this if they lost to another empire. Debt slaves were people with massive debt. Depending on how much they accumulated and with who they could end up in slavery if they couldn't pay up. Sometimes people even sold their family members as collateral damage, and they would be in this category. In this world, a person wouldn't be able to easily escape after they were branded a slave. People would earn this title through trial by judge. This title would show up during identifications via skills or magical devices. Most of the time it would be a lifelong sentence. The title would then stick with the person till the end of their life. There were certain ways of removing it. This mostly happened after a master was acquired. This person could then set the slave free after a small ritual. The title didn't compel the slave to follow his or her master's orders. The person still needed to be kept in check. There were ways of doing it. The easiest way was by the use of slave collars. These devices came in various shapes and sizes. The slaves mostly wore them around their necks. There were also smaller versions like rings and bracelets. The slave collars would give out electrical discharges to the person wearing them. These caused excruciating pain to the affected person and were activated by a slave owner's remote device. Some collars even added explosives that would cause instant death, but were mostly reserved for the more dangerous offenders. "Here you go, eat up." Roland was handed some stew by the husky-looking lady. He just nodded with his head while thanking her and walked a bit to the side. Luckily no one had decided to talk to him and he could enjoy his meal in silence. It wasn't the greatest, but it was better than the dried meat that he had with him. While munching to the side, he eavesdropped on some of the conversations that the people were having, mostly out of boredom. "Heard the goods are a bit special this time around." "Yeah, these ones will go for a steep price." The ones talking were the guards from the slaver cart. Roland believed that these goods that they were talking about were probably the slaves inside it. This also explained the iron bars, but even without them, the slaves wouldn't get far if they had the slave collars on them. The slavers had 4 wagons with them. 3 for the slaves to be sold off and another one for the workers and soldiers. He was interested in these special goods, but not enough to snoop around. This was the reality of this world. He had to think about himself first and not others. After eating up, he decided to return to the back of the carriage cart. Some people set up tents while others just slept in sleeping bags out in the open. Roland had no tent and he would rather just lean against a crate with a blanket over himself than spend it outside. The adventurers took turns on guard duty and the night went past without a problem. Roland didn't get in much sleep as always. He was still slightly stressed. During the bouts of sleeplessness, he just trained his mana reinforcement skill. The journey continued. There was nothing in particular happening. On the second day, the caravan suffered a small monster attack. Some familiar-looking boar monsters appeared. Roland didn't need to act. The adventurers were more than enough to handle this small beast attack. This even allowed the people to feast on some monster boar meat, which was quite a delicacy in these parts. After the show of strength, Roland started worrying less about the continued journey ahead. The people protecting them looked at least decent in their battles. Unless a large group of Tier 2 monsters appeared, they should be safe on their journey. They weren't traveling through lands with many powerful monsters, so it seemed like the expedition to his new town would be uneventful. The day turned into night and nothing out of the ordinary was happening. Roland continued to listen to the other people speak while training his new skill. He could feel that his mana was getting stronger with each passing day, unlocking the third level was on the horizon. At about half mark of the journey, the caravan of wagons arrived at a mountain range. This was a winding path that stayed close to the cliffs with not much wiggle room. This was the part of the trek that Roland was worried about. One wrong step or a scared animal and someone could end up falling down the cliffs. He broke off his mana reinforcement training and decided to stay vigilant. He still lacked any type of detection skills, so he took out one of his runic devices. It was just a round piece of metal that was the size of an apple. This was a common grade detection spell that he crafted. He placed it on a round piece of metal just so that he would get more uses out of it. It would slowly shrink after getting repaired, but due to the thickness, it would last him for a while. This item acted like a sonar. When he activated it, he could see living creatures in a set radius. The more mana he inserted, the further the range would expand. He gave it a try and activated the detection device, but frowned the moment he did. There are too many people here. The device showed him a sort of holographic image with a lot of dots. These dots were people in near proximity, while the device he was using was the middle part. When he activated it, he just saw a large mass of blue dots crowding the whole space. This item only had two colors, blue and red. Blue would be people of the races, while red would be monsters. It was also tricky to tell if someone was above or below the user of this item, as it only showed the glowing orbs on a flat surface. This is what I get for not testing it out in the field. It would probably work well in a dungeon corridor though. He shrugged while leaning back in the cart. He started periodically activating the item, but the blue dots crowded the magical radar that had only about 50 meters of range. They traveled higher and higher and were now reaching the top of this mountain. After reaching it, they would just need to descend to reach the other side. After this, it would be smooth sailing to the port city. That is, if they made it. Roland used his detection item once more and noticed something. He was counting the blue dots out of boredom, and he noticed some more on the edges of this radar. He quickly did a double take and could see the blue dots approaching. At first he thought that maybe it was other merchants also using this route. That theory was quickly abolished by an arrow lodging itself into the wooden box he was leaning against. Bandits! Roland looked at his detection ball and wanted to toss it out of the wagon he was in. He quickly looked outside his cart and could see the adventurers and guards getting ready for a fight. The biggest problem was that the bandits had the high ground. Of course, this would happen just when we were about to reach the top. He grimaced while grabbing his magical wand. He wasn't sure if the adventurers would be enough to take out these bandits. He might have to get his hands dirty. Chapter 58 New Headache. Roland's body twitched as he felt cold. He began to slowly open his eyes while having a tough time remembering what happened. He was instantly greeted by a splitting headache. His vision felt muddled and it took a couple of seconds for it to focus. He found himself in an unfamiliar location, if you could call it that. What he saw was an uneven ceiling that consisted of just rocks and dirt. The walls were uneven with bugs crawling on them. He was clearly in some kind of cave. There was some light coming out from the side, probably the cave's entrance. Thanks to it he could barely see, as he didn't possess any night-seeing skills or abilities. He felt terrible, as if a stampede of horses ran him over. He knew that something was wrong and he needed to assess the situation. First, he checked if he was in any condition to fight. He did this by trying to stand up. Luckily, besides some bruises and a splitting headache, nothing was broken. There was a lack of bindings around his feet and arms, so he felt like he wasn't captured by anything or anyone. There was also the possibility that the person that brought him here didn't see him as a threat. It could be a Tier 2 or Tier 3 being that judged his danger level to be quite low. He leaned back against the wall as his vision slowly started returning. He quickly looked to the side and found that his arming sword wasn't there. He had his wands and his bags of holding still on him, which made him sigh out in relief. Roland tried recalling what had transpired before he went unconscious. He remembered being in one of the wagons before a group of bandits attacked them. An arrow made its way through the cart he was in and landed on one of the boxes. Then it all began, and also when it all went wrong. He jumped outside as the carriage stopped in its tracks. The way forward was blocked off and the bandits attacked. They were safely up on a faraway ledge above them and had an easy way to pelt them with more arrows. Roland ducked behind the cart he was previously inside. It didn't have much protection on the inside as it only had a cloth covering the framing as a roof. Outside he could at least hide behind the undercarriage, and also the boxes on the inside would stop the arrows from penetrating further in. The hired adventurers and the guards sprung into action. They in a similar fashion tried blocking the arrow paths with the wagons and carts. Some of them had large shields and bows of their own to fire back. There were more people on the caravan's side, but at least half were non-combatants. People just traveling, merchants, and their families. This left the adventurers and the guards that came with the slave traders as the fighting force. The bandits had prepared themselves for this ambush. They put up a barricade made from logs to block the way forward. There was also a group of men standing there with bows and crossbows. The way back was blocked off by them pushing large rocks down from the cliff above. They had also brought some cover for themselves and could fire upon the caravan without the worry of getting hit themselves. Their thick wooden barricade above couldn't be pierced even by Tier 2 archers that were amongst the adventurers. It was clear that the bandits didn't want to take any prisoners. They encased them in a trap and would slowly whittle them down. They could probably blow them up with explosives if they wanted to, but they probably didn't want to damage the items they could plunder. The adventurers and soldiers set up a defensive perimeter by pushing the carts together. They were only able to make a half circle with nowhere to run. They all were now high up in the mountains with a drop to their doom behind them. The fog was thick so they couldn't really tell what was down there. They all presumed that falling down was a one-way ticket to their afterlife. Roland found himself next to a family of 3. The child was crying in her mother's arms while the husband was to the side with a dagger in his hand. He didn't look like someone that knew how to handle such a tool. His hands were trembling and his eyes were darting between a few places. Roland could identify these 3 people and clearly see their classes. The child had none, the father had a farmer class while the woman was a cook. Classes like this existed, mostly they signified that the person that had it was unfit for combat. They failed to reach the threshold of achieving even the simplest class like warrior or archer. They were also more common than people might think. The exchange continued for a while, but soon enough the bandits switched to fire arrows and flammable cocktails. Some of the wooden carriages started burning along with the items inside. The biggest problem was on the slavers' side as they had people on the inside. Before things could get any uglier, Roland decided to act. He had an option of either helping these people out or running away on his own. He didn't owe anyone anything here, but he didn't feel like leaving defenseless children behind. It would leave a distasteful taste behind in his mouth if he abandoned kids and women to just die. He felt that with a larger number of people there would be a bigger chance of survival. There was strength in numbers and nowhere to go but forward. First, he used one of his runic scrolls to put out the fire on the carriages. The heat was pushing people away from the protective barricade, which would then leave them open to arrow attacks. He combined 2 spells, one to make water and another one to freeze it. First, the water splashed against the flames, then with the addition of the cold, the fire subsided. The people looked at him with surprise in their eyes as he wasn't part of the adventurers or the guards. After putting out the fire, Roland took out an orb of some sort. It looked like a tennis ball-sized sphere made from metal. He made his best baseball pitcher impression while throwing this ball at the bandits above them. It made a nice arc while going towards its target. The bandits took notice of the spellcaster among the caravan, but it was a bit too late. They also noticed him throw something their way. This caused them to back away while putting up regular shields. The ball of metal collided with one of those shields and just bounced off. It tumbled down and away from the bandits that looked at it curiously. It looked like Roland threw a round rock at them, which caused more eyebrows to raise. The men dropped their shields and were ready to return fire. It looked like the attack was a dud and they panicked for no reason. Before they could continue though, they heard a strange sound. The ball of metal then promptly exploded like a grenade. They were greeted by a small ball of fire and pieces of sharp metal. The metal caused widespread injuries while the explosion pushed them back. This was an item that Roland made in his spare time. He combined both his runic craftsmanship along with his runic scrolls. The metallic ball was hollow on the inside with a little slit through which he could fit a small version of a scroll in. Thanks to his condensation skill, he was now able to miniaturize his scrolls even further. The scroll was placed inside and he added runic parts to the ball. They mostly consisted of ethereal pathways so that he could activate it. So a runic grenade came to be. The moment it exploded, the metal encasing that the runic scroll was in would go flying in all directions. He had a couple of versions, some exploded within 10 seconds, some even faster. He used a more delayed version first to catch the people off guard. If it exploded too soon, they might have defended themselves with their shields. He was banking on their curiosity getting the better of them and was rewarded for it. He threw another grenade towards the bandits. One of them saw this and moved forward. The man saw the explosion from the side and realized what this item was. He also was thinking that he had enough time to deflect it. To his surprise, this orb exploded much sooner than the previous one. The adventurers had tried using some of their own enchanted spell scrolls before. Yet the bandits' shielding barricade and the mountain walls proved to be a good defense against them. The spells traveled in a straight line, but Roland could throw his nades in an arch behind the enemy line to hit them. The adventurers used this chance to fire off some arrows and bolts towards their enemies. Finally, the battle started shifting, even more after Roland unloaded his most powerful spell. A large ball of condensed fire collided with the barricade and makeshift shielding that the bandits constructed above. This was a fire blast spell empowered by Roland's large amount of mana. It caused wide destruction to the robbers' side and it looked like the people here would be getting out alive. Roland even managed to clear out part of the other barricade that was blocking the path forward. With his high mana pool, the runic spells that he could cast were many times stronger than if a regular person activated them. The bandits were sore losers though. They still had the high ground and a plan B. This plan consisted of pushing massive boulders down below and causing a rock slide. Just as the people were close to cheering, they were pelted by rocks. The large stones crushed the carts and carriages and rolled forward. Roland grasped his hurting head and felt that it had been bandaged up. He didn't remember much after that. The ensuing rock slide caused part of the people to fall down to the misty pit below. He only recalled putting up as many magic shields as he could on himself and the people next to him. I must have survived the fall and someone brought me here. Roland took out a healing potion from one of his bags and quickly drank it. He noticed that someone tried bandaging up some of his wounds, but they did a poor job. It looked like the bandages were part of their clothes. His weapon was missing. Either it was taken by the person who patched him up or it was lost during the fall. He needed to get more information first. While getting himself together, he moved towards the light. He leaned against the walls a bit while slowly walking. The potion was slow working and his body was still aching. Before he could get outside, he heard someone talking. He heard a man's voice and one that was more high-pitched. "Lady Arid Hell, we must move quickly, this is our chance to escape. Log on, why did you take our savior's weapon? Return it, we should wait till he recovers his health." But what if a monster appears or those bandits? Roland could hear the two arguing. The man was referring to the woman as lady, which made him think that she was some kind of noble. Were there hidden nobles in the caravan? It was quite uncommon for nobles to travel in such a way. They would have their own luxury carriage and the protection of some knights. They wouldn't travel along with merchants and commoners unless they were hiding from something or someone. He couldn't get much information from their conversation. The man wanted to leave along with his enchanted arming sword. The woman on the other hand wanted to wait for him to get better. The woman didn't seem to be the problem, but he needed to be wary of the man. First, he needed to actually see what he was working with. While the two were busy arguing, he pulled out his detection device and activated it. Due to fearing that the people would detect his mana, he inserted the bare minimum of magic into his detector. This would shorten the distance of the skin but would be harder to detect. From the image he could see that besides the two there was another person with them. He or she was a bit further away, so he now knew how many potential enemies he had. He had a couple of things he could do now. He could either wait it out, they might decide to leave instantly. He could also ambush them and try getting his sword back that the man was holding on to. The cave bent a bit so they couldn't see him hiding here. He would probably have the element of surprise on his side. Then the third option would be to just go out and talk. The woman didn't seem to have any ulterior motives and she might be the one in charge. The man was probably her guard, he could judge him to be a threat and try attacking him though. While he was thinking about what to do, another option arose. It began with a familiar scream that he had heard so many times before. Goblins. Roland had killed so many of those little buggers that he could tell them apart from any other humanoid monster by the scream. Lady Aridhel, get behind me. It looked like a fight was breaking out. Thanks to this, Roland was able to stick his head out to see what he was working with. Just like he heard before, he saw a man and a woman. They were similar looking to two people he had seen before. They both had dark skin and long silver hair. They had the characteristics of moon elves and the long ears gave it away. What surprised Roland wasn't their race but what they were wearing. The girl had a dirty-looking white dress and no shoes. It looked to be ripped up in a couple of places. He instantly could tell that this ripped-up dress were the bandages that were wrapped around his head. The man also had simple clothes and was holding his arming sword with one hand while glaring at a mountain variant of a goblin. The most surprising part wasn't their haggard looks, no, it was what they were wearing around their necks. Slaves. Roland mumbled to himself. The two clearly had slave collars around their necks. From what he knew, these collars could be activated to send electricity down an unruly slave's body. Some could even explode. There was also another feature, it blocked the use of any active skills or mana circulation. Even if the moon elf man wanted to use his runic sword, he wouldn't be able to. He moved his neck out even more and looked to where the third person would be. The appearance of this person was also quite peculiar. His skin was light green and he looked to be over 2.5 meters tall. His body was very muscular and also filled with wounds. This person looked to be a half-orc. This race had a connection to the orcs, which were considered monsters. The half-orcs were considered smarter than their rage-filled relatives and also smaller. A true orc would normally be half a head taller than this one. Just like the two elves, this person also had a collar around his neck. In his hand was a large makeshift club made from a thick tree branch. He was engaged in a battle with some goblins that were poking his legs with their spears. The half-orc looked to be having trouble in hitting the little buggers as they were nimble enough to back away from his range. Why does it always have to be goblins? Should have used more mana with the radar. Roland grasped his magic wand and pointed it out of the cave. The monsters didn't notice him yet, he could get a few free shots. He took aim at what seemed to be the strongest out of the bunch, a hobgoblin quite similar to the one he once slew. He didn't have his traps, nor did he have the high ground. His sword was in the hands of the elven man, who couldn't even use it to its full potential. Luckily Roland had some other weapons stashed away with him. One was the heavy rapier that he had gotten all those years ago. Roland concentrated and took aim, waiting for the right moment to attack. He needed to make this count. His mana was injected into his wand, his target being the spot between the goblin's eyes. Chapter 59 Slightly Bigger Goblin Slayer to the Rescue. Logon was his name. He was a moon elf hailing from the kingdom of Belia that bordered the Cauldries kingdom. He was a young warrior that took on the swordsman route, and this was also the class that he had now. Belia was a country composed mostly of moon elves, and it was the counterpart of the holy kingdom of Alexandria that most sun elves lived in. Both of these races didn't see eye to eye. There was a buffer between them in the form of the Cauldries kingdom. This didn't allow combat to happen and made but also caused the Middle Kingdom to act as a mediator. The Moon Elves didn't have a single monarch like most of the kingdoms. The ruling class was composed of houses that elected one head. These heads would then form the Moon Elf Council of Elders and perform votes on important matters. Lady Aridhel was someone from such a house. She would be considered a noble if you applied human standards to her status. She was related to one of the current elders but was just one of the many children. Aradhel was tasked with going to the Kaldri's kingdom, just some work requiring diplomacy. Regretfully they were attacked by unknown forces. The people there were clearly aiming to make a profit. Instead of killing everyone, they were sold off as slaves. The attack didn't happen that long ago and they were in the midst of being moved around. The slavers had bought them off the assailants and they were being moved towards a slave auction to be sold. The convoy was attacked by bandits while they remained in one of the carts and behind bars. During the ensuing battle, one of the rocks collided with their carriage and they fell down below. During the chaos of the fall, they were surrounded by various mana bubbles. This and the large river below was why they had survived the fall. The reinforced cage was smashed in certain places and even though they suffered some minor injuries they were now free to leave. He together with a half-orc and his lady Aradhel managed to crawl out. This is also where they found another lone survivor that his lady demanded they helped. Fast forward to now and they were facing off against a large group of goblins. There were even several hobgoblins sprinkled into the mix. Due to the slave collars around their necks, none of them could use any of their advanced skills. If they tried, a massive electric shock would be discharged right into their necks. Logon was grasping a one-handed sword with his hand. He had taken it away from the unconscious human that his lady ordered him to carry inside of a cave. He already noticed that this wasn't a simple sword as it had various runic symbols on it. This would be helpful in this fight if he could use his mana, that is. In his hands, it was just a regular steel sword, not much better than your average blade. The craftsmanship wasn't anything out of the ordinary. To the side was a peculiar ally of him and his moon elf lady. A half-orc that Aradhel managed to somehow bring over to their side. He didn't trust this person that much but he was someone that they needed right now. His name was Goblin and he wasn't the brightest. Goblin was swinging a large log that he used as a club around and smacking some goblins away. They kept their distance though, poking him with some crude spears. The large half-orc seemed to be having trouble with these fast-moving shrimps. He moved his gaze forward towards his own enemy. There it stood, a more robust-looking monster, a hobgoblin. It wasn't the only one in this group as he could see another one moving towards Golgrim's direction. "Puny goblins, no, run away!" The half-orc shouted out while delivering a devastating strike to a nearby rock. Even though he also was wearing a slave collar, his natural strength was enough to make him a priority target. This was also probably why most of the hobgoblins from this group were moving towards him. If only I could use my skills. Logon thought to himself while looking at the weapon that the hobgoblin had in his hand. He had a large metal mace. Combined with the creature's enhanced strength, it was a deadly item. If he got hit with it directly even once, he would probably suffer a critical blow. Without any armor, he was more or less defenseless against it. He was tier 2 swordsman himself, so he knew that the weapon he was holding would probably snap in a direct exchange. He would need to use his speed and footwork to get in a good stab while the beast is off balance. He had to protect the lady behind him. With the slave collar around her neck, she was more or less useless. She possessed a class that only shone when using mana, without it she wasn't much stronger than a newbie tier 1. The battle was finally starting. The hobgoblin wasn't the only enemy. One of its minions charged forward in a blind attack. It met a swift demise. Logon shifted his body to the side and evaded its attack. His footwork helped him get into a good position to stab the arming sword through the creature's eye socket, killing it instantly. The hobgoblin gave out a big scream but didn't charge forward. Instead, more of the regular mountain goblins appeared. They all started running towards him from various directions. They were clearly trying to overwhelm him with their numbers. If he was alone then it would be fine, but he had a defenseless woman to protect. He couldn't let any of these small monsters through, otherwise, the lady he swore to protect could be in danger. Logon would normally not have much trouble dispatching these monsters. But he was in a weakened state, long travels without food or a warm place to sleep. Then they fall down from the mountain top was causing him to run on fumes. The first goblin was greeted by a slash to the neck, its head fell off cleanly and landed in the bushes. The other goblins didn't falter and continued their assault by swinging their rusty weapons that they had stolen from adventurers. 2, 3, and then 4. More goblins fell to his borrowed sword, but his streak would be coming to an end soon. The fifth goblin came in swinging. Logon's reaction was slow and he finally suffered a blow to his side. With lacking armor, the cut was deeper than usual and the moon elf faltered. The goblin, seeing its enemy backing away, moved in for the kill, but to only receive a sword stab directly to the heart. Logon! Aradhel called out from behind him in concern. He grasped his bleeding wound while gritting his teeth. Stay back, I'm fine when I give you the signal, run away Lady Aradhel. Logon knew his body better than anybody else. Even before engaging in this battle, he realized that his chances of winning were slim. He was just tired, the lack of sleep and nourishment had caused his body to wither away. He didn't see himself winning against the hobgoblin without his skills, even with those it would be hard to do in his current state. What are you talking about, Logon? We are going to make it out together. The moon elf woman called out while clutching her hands together. She knew that she wouldn't be much of a help in this fight, but she had to aid him somehow. She grasped a weapon that one of the killed goblins previously had. It was a rusty short sword, the blade had already dulled with time. What are you doing, Lady Aradhel? You must flee, I'll distract them. Logon looked back to where the hobgoblin was. The monster had made up its decision and was now charging forward. It sacrificed a few of its subordinates to land the wound on the strong enemy, and now it was time to reap the rewards. It didn't see the woman as a target worth its attention, it focused on the male moon elf and swung its large mace. Logon jumped to the side while the mace connected with the spot he was previously in. This wasn't just a regular random swing, the hobgoblin's arm muscles expanded. The moment the mace connected with the hard ground, a large dust cloud was kicked up. Pieces of dirt and rock flew in all directions and even caused Aradhel to fall onto her backside in fright. Even before she could help with the battle, she was already down on the ground. She was clearly not someone that was used to this, her body shook in fright at the display of power that the monster possessed. This wasn't over, the monster didn't give Logon time to relax. It continued with its charge. The injured moon elf was unable to retaliate, as dodging the rapid blows of the hobgoblin was the most he could do. This would have been a good chance for the one he was responsible to escape. The stubborn girl didn't listen though, instead, she stood up with the weapon in hand and angrily threw it at the hobgoblin. The monster was preoccupied with chasing after Logon, so it received the attack to its back. The damage it took was minimal. The short sword was far too dull and the throw was uncoordinated and weak. No, run! He called out and tried moving forward. The moment Aradhel performed this action, her fate was sealed. The enraged hobgoblin turned around and gave out a strange high-pitched shout that immobilized both of them momentarily. It then bolted towards the person that attacked it from the back. The angry-looking Aradhel quickly changed her expression to one of horror. Before she could run away, she heard a voice behind her. It was coming from the cave. Hey you, get down! You're in the way. It was a man's voice, but it sounded still slightly youthful. Logon could see the person that Aradhel helped patch up standing at the entrance to the cave. He was holding a metallic object and pointing it forward. He wasn't sure what this item was at first, but soon enough he realized. The item started glowing in a bright red color. Vague runic symbols appeared around the whole piece of metal, and it was as if tiny fireflies were coming together onto the tip. Aradhel was stunned at first, but she somehow kept cool under pressure. After seeing the person that she helped out pointing a magical rod at her, she realized what he was doing. She instantly dropped down to reveal the hobgoblin's form to the man in front. The moment she did, a bright flash of red followed by an explosion of heat materialized. From the weapon that this person was holding, a large surge of energy traveled forward. This heated energy collided with the monster's face and caused a small explosion. The creature dropped its large mace while the momentum of its run carried its lower body forward. The top part on the other hand snapped backward due to the strength of the spell. After the smoke had cleared, the people there were greeted with a melted hobgoblin face. The monster wasn't quite dead yet, but it was clearly out of commission. Roland had been waiting in the cave for some time. He had been there a moment before the goblin attack. He had waited while watching the moon elf fighting to measure his strength. The man was clearly strong, but his movements felt sluggish. Soon he needed to spring into action, as he didn't quite want these people to die yet. After the hobgoblin went down, the battle still continued. There were more regular goblins around that were moving forward after their leader succumbed to the spell. The half-orc in the background was also covered in wounds after having to tussle with the small monsters for so long. The regular goblins didn't pose much of a threat. They all succumbed to a barrage of regular mana arrows and mana bolts that Roland could produce with one of his earlier magic wand creations. Both of the moon elves looked on with astonishment at the fast casting that this human mage was capable of. That's most of the ones here, the ones that remain are. Roland looked to the distance and could see the third person still battling. The half-orc didn't look that good. He could see multiple stab wounds in his legs, and there were even broken spears sticking out of his flesh. Goblin had managed to slay one of the hobgoblin attackers, but was now at the mercy of the last one. Luckily for him, help was soon to arrive. It came in the form of a red energy bolt that collided with the hobgoblin's shoulder. It wasn't a clean hit, and the monster dodged to the side. It suffered some burns and residual damage. This wasn't enough to defeat the creature, but it was enough for it to back away. Hobgoblins were smarter than regular goblins, and this one here could see that the battle was lost. Most of its brethren were dead. The evolved variants that were similar to its strength were also gone. The monster had decided to flee. It let out a high-pitched scream and turned around. The goblins that remained listened to its call and started running. The battle was over. Roland looked at his wand that he had used in this battle. It was the same one he activated during the fiasco back in Edelgard. He could clearly see that the runic components had deteriorated. He would need to repair it, otherwise after one more spell it would be hard to salvage. It was one thing to repair one of these weapons and another to perform the whole rune crafting process from start to finish. Roland had a decision to make now. He could see the moon elf male collapsing onto the ground and clutching the side of his stomach. The woman who he was with had run up to him and was looking over his wound. The large half-orc that was fighting the goblins was also looking quite distraught. His large muscular body was riddled with cuts and scratches, even with bite marks. Somehow he was standing, but he would probably not last long if he wasn't treated. Roland glanced to his belt where his bags of holding were in. He had some healing potions in there, but should he share his limited stock with these people? He had saved their lives, but he also owed one of their members his. He might have been goblin food by now if they didn't drag him into this cave after he passed out. While he was contemplating his next move, the two moon elves were talking. The lady was wincing while pinching her lips as the battle wound that her bodyguard received was deep. He was slowly bleeding out. If the wound would later become infected was also a possibility. If only I didn't have this collar on, I could heal you instantly. Roland's attention was moved to these words. If what she said was true, then she might have been someone that possessed a healing class. Maybe he wouldn't need to give out precious healing items to strangers. Don't worry about my lady Aradhel. I will only slow you down. Stop talking nonsense, log on, I can't abandon you. Roland listened to the two dramatically exchanging words with each other. He didn't really want to use up his healing potions, but he wasn't the type of person that would let people die in front of him. He was also helped by them, so he owed them one. Before he could aid them, the woman did something unusual. She placed her hands on the man's wound and it looked like she was trying to cast a spell. Lady Aradhel, what are you doing? The man shouted while the slave collar activated around the woman's neck. It produced a faint spark that caused her body to go stiff. It was as if she was struck by a taser that also had a pain magnifying feature. He could hear her scream, which prompted him to go over. The man tried helping the moon elven woman up, but while doing this, he caused his wound to bleed even more. If left to their devices, these two would probably not survive for too long. "What the hell are you two doing?" Roland called out while going over. He looked at the collapsed woman. She was quite the beauty that would make most men's hearts flutter, but she looked weak and sickly. The moment he came over, the man by the name Logon became weary of him. "Relax, I'm not going to hurt you. We can call it even, you did help me out a bit." Roland pointed to the bandages around his head while blankly looking at the collapsed woman and her retainer. The man was still holding onto his sword. "Also, can you return my sword? I kind of need it." The two started staring at each other. Roland just waited with an outstretched hand. The icebreaker was the moon elven woman that finally woke up after the neck taser episode. "Return his sword, Logon, it doesn't belong to you." "But..." The man looked at the person he was serving. He was quick to give in and returned the weapon to the man he took it from. Roland took it back without answering and quickly activated his debugging skill to see if everything was in place. Luckily, the man using this sword wasn't half bad. He knew how to hit the goblins without damaging the blade. As Roland was looking back down after examining his sword, he noticed something peculiar. He activated his debugging skill again while looking at the neck of one of the elves. He could clearly see that there were runic components there. "So did you say that you could heal if that collar was off? Can I take a closer look at it?" Roland said while the two moon elves looked at him funny, not really sure where the young man was going with this. Chapter 60 Impromptu Party. "So, they even branded you." The sound of a crackling fireplace could be heard while some people talked. A slight clank of metal against metal was also discernible. Regretfully so. A woman in a black coat was holding her hands out toward the fire. Her skin was dark caramel and she had quite the long ears. Her name was Aridhel and she was part of the Moon Elven nobility. "Those damn bastards, if I ever get my hands on them." Another moon elf was here. This one was a bit angrier looking as he started spitting out profanities. "Hey, stop moving. If I make any mistakes, your head could blow up." Next to him was a dark-haired youth. Roland was his name and he was holding onto his blacksmith hammer. He was in the process of gently hammering the slave collar with it. "I can remove these, but can't really do much about those branding marks. You'll have to hide them while returning to your own country." Roland had examined Aridhel's slave collar first. It was something made by a runesmith, so he could easily inspect the components in it. With the help of his debugging and rune crafting skills, he was able to find the prime rune. With its destruction, the shackles became nothing more than neck accessories. Prying them off was another thing entirely. Even though the rune crafting job was done sloppily, this item was still made from deep steel. It was much harder to break than regular steel and also resistant to magic to some degree. After deactivating the prime rune, the locking mechanism was also rendered ineffective, so he needed to use some tools to fiddle it open. Roland wasn't sure at first if he should do this. The people were branded as criminal slaves, though that was a lie. He heard them talking before he saved them and it was clear that they were just captured to be sold. He wasn't sure if it was another squabble between noble parties, but at this point in his life, he wouldn't be surprised. The woman might have been an eyesore for someone in her own house. This wasn't the main reason that he decided to help them. That was the monster problem outside. The mountain was swarming with goblins, hobgoblins, and other monstrosities. He wasn't even a Tier 2 class holder. The chances of getting out of here in one piece were slim. He needed some backup. Roland didn't want to rely on these strangers, but he didn't see himself getting out of here without some help. In the event of a betrayal, he did prepare some countermeasures, plus he could always run. The woman was a priest not of Solaria but of Lunaris instead. This was also the biggest reason the Moon Elves and Sun Elves were at each other's throats. They both had different deities that allowed them to have priest classes. The healing magic of the Moon Elves was a bit different, but it worked in a similar fashion. When it came down to gaming terms, the Moon Priests were better at buffing their party while Sun Priests were ahead in terms of pure healing. There were also variations of the classes and some special ones that were great at both. Think that should do it. Clink. He gently tapped the collar that was around Logon's neck and it popped right off this time around. Roland grabbed the piece of deep steel and placed it inside his storage bag. He could melt these down later and maybe create a fitting weapon for himself. Goblin turn now. There was a third member of these slaves, the large half-orc. Roland was a bit on the fence about setting this one free, but the moon elf woman assured him that he could be trusted. Yes, yes. Just sit down and try not to move. He got back to work while the conversation continued. I'd advise you to just cover up and head for the nearest settlement. You're not going through the border with those clothes or that slave status. From Roland's perspective, it would be hard for those three to flee back to their own country. The slave collars were gone, but they still had the slave status on them. There was a certain process through which a person became a criminal slave. It involved some paperwork and a person with a judge class. This was something akin to a curse, but it could only be removed by someone with a similar judge class. This slave status mostly came with a timer, but regretfully theirs was close to 100 years. I'm thankful for all you did, Carmine, but we can take care of ourselves. I will bring the lady back safely. Goblin strong, no problem. Both Logon and the half-orc were apparently not worried about getting over the border. He wasn't sure what they were planning, but not like he would be going there with them. He also decided to give them a fake name. Carmine came to be after he thought back to his red comet signature on the scrolls that he used for his wares. Yes, Mr. Carmine, you already did so much for us. You even gave us some clothes and food. Aradhel replied while munching on some beef jerky. The two were clearly malnourished, so he decided to aid them a bit. He wasn't doing it for free though, he would be getting most if not all of the mana stones from the monsters they slew. He started with the 2 hobgoblins and now he had 2 more common grade stones to add to his new creations. He also gave the swordsman elf a spare sword while taking the enchanted one he had for himself. The costs would probably equal themselves after he attained more mana stones. Moving safely in a group with 2 tier 2 warriors would also be worthwhile. The elven maiden was just a tier 1 class, not even a full priest. Her class was called Acolyte and it was similar to the Sun Church's cleric class. That's why he decided to invest in his new party. He lent one of his old robes to the woman, though he wasn't willing to give up his good leather armor. He was still a bit stingy in that regard. Helping them warm up and eat would be enough. They now had weapons, and with the Acolyte in their party, they wouldn't need to waste potions. Clang! The largest slave collar was finally gone and it was thrown into his spatial bag. He was really glad that he spent the money on them during his time in Edelgard. The half-orc that was now free of the slave collar performed a strange jiggle. It looks like a sort of dance. He evaded the large hug that the mountain of muscles tried giving him and went over to the fireplace. What are you going to do if you run into those slavers? Roland asked while sitting down. This was also a possibility. If they survived, the slavers could still be there. The bandits suffered some casualties and might have abandoned the chase as well. Maybe the people that were left from the caravan were looking for them now. Kill them all. The silver-haired moon elf male replied while looking at the new sword in his hand. It was clear that he wouldn't hesitate. We wouldn't want to cause trouble for you, Mr. Carmine, but I don't think they would just let us be. Don't worry, we don't expect you to involve yourself with us for much longer. Aradhel knew what Roland was getting at. He already could be branded as a criminal by setting them free. They were considered criminal slaves, and even though that was a lie, it would have to be proven first. If he went and aided them in a battle against the slave traders, he would be labeled as another bandit. That was something that he wanted to avoid at all costs. Having a wanted poster going around the kingdom would throw a wrench into his future plans. First, he needed to get out of this predicament alive. Well, I can always say that you forced me to remove those collars. There is a village if we follow the river, we should go there. Roland did bring a map of the area and had some prior knowledge of where he was traveling. He knew that it was always important to know your location and the geography of it. He decided to go towards the closest settlement. He could try returning to where the caravan was attacked. The possibility of running into the bandits was high. They could have a hidden camp somewhere in the mountains as well. His 3 new companions would stand out quite a bit. 2 moon elves and a large half-orc don't usually move around together. If the slave traders survived, they would probably start searching for their runaways. Yes, that would be a good place to move. We can find provisions for our journey back home there. The elven woman replied while sipping on some tea. Roland was an avid tea drinker and he did have some fresh water and tea leaves with himself. Though the fresh water came in the form of a magic item. It was a steel tea kettle that had a small lesser rune on it. When mana was inserted, water would be produced. Lady Aridhel, you should go to sleep. It has been a long day. I will watch over you. The quartet had moved to a different cave, but it wasn't far away from the old one. They feared that the fresh goblin blood would attract monsters during the night. Logon was already rested as he had passed out after getting stabbed. Soon after, he was healed by Aridhel, which now gave him enough vitality to stay up through the night. Roland was a bit apprehensive about having 3 unknown people around him. He did have a few magical items to help him sleep better. After activating them, an alarm would go off as well as a shield would be placed around his body. This was only a precaution, as he didn't really think that they would dispose of him now. They still needed him to get things for them in the village. He already helped them as well. There wasn't any reason for them to think that he would double-cross them. He had the chance to kill them already, and instead he helped them by removing the slave collars. Roland finally leaned back against one of the walls. He had a pillow for himself, but that was it. He placed it against the hard rock before resting. He already knew that he wouldn't be sleeping that much, but he could at least rest his eyes. It took him quite a while to fall asleep as always. The only saving grace was that he could feel out his new companions, and as he reasoned, they didn't cause any trouble. He got a couple of hours of sleep and was up just as the sun was rising. At the entrance, he could see a snoozing green skin. The big lug was supposed to take over Logon's shift, but had apparently dozed off in the middle. His large frame might have been enough to scare off some of the monsters though. Good morning. Roland nodded at Aridhel while standing up. He placed his hand on his own neck and gave out a grunt. Yeah, good morning. He replied while trying to ignore his stiff neck. The moon elven lady looked quite beautiful and she also greeted him with a nice smile. The girl was surprisingly positive about her situation. He wasn't sure if it was just an act or just a character trait. Think we should move, we don't know what might happen. Roland nodded at Logon's call out. Staying in this place for too long would be a bad idea. They would need at least 3 days to get to the settlement, maybe even longer. I agree, we should probably hunt something along the way. The rations that I brought with me will run out soon. Roland didn't expect to have party members that he would need to feed. He also didn't have that much space in his storage bags. They were mostly filled with various tools and materials. You should probably wake him up. Roland pointed at Goblin that was snoring loudly and scratching his behind. It was surprising how relaxed he was and how well he could sleep on the rocky ground. They all finally gathered up. Roland lent Logon some spare shoes and some sandals to Aridhel as he felt sorry for their shabby looks. Walking barefoot for 3 days would probably be very taxing. He didn't have anything for the half-orc though, but that one looked comfortable walking without any boots on. They started going. Logon and Goblin were in the front with Aridhel in the middle and Roland in the back. This wasn't the greatest setup as they didn't have anyone with a scout or tracking like class. He would need to use his detection device to somehow fill that role. The acolyte was the weakest of the group, so they decided to put her in the middle. She could heal moderate wounds and perform certain buffing spells. It didn't take the party long to meet their first opponent. It weren't goblins or hobgoblins this time around. These creatures that they came across were something new that even Roland had never seen before. Adolescent Bokanok L46. He identified the creature's name and level. The creature had a humanoid shape with long lanky arms and a goat head. Their legs had hooves and it looked like a satyr below the waist. This was a type of goat monster with giant horns and crooked teeth. It wasn't alone, as there was a similar looking one next to it, at a similar level as well. This was when he noticed the weakness of this party. The moment Goblin noticed the creatures, he bolted forward. Goblin bash ugly goat. He gave out a roar that caused the two monsters to focus on him. This would be a fine start, but the loud scream also alerted more of these monsters to their whereabouts. Roland could see them popping out from the bushes. The moment they did, Logon decided to move back. "Get behind me, Lady Aridhel." The moon elf was sticking to his duties as a bodyguard a bit too much, while the half-orc just charged into the distance, leaving the rest of the party behind. What was left was a fight at two fronts, with also losing the element of surprise. "These guys don't really know how to work together," Aridhel complained while her companion stuck to her like a tick. Two other Bokanoks came out from the sides and locked on the two elves. It was lucky that they ignored him for now. This gave Roland ample time to use his wand that he had repaired the day before. A bolt of heated energy collided with one of the goat heads. The scream that the monster gave out was truly frightening. This would have been a good moment for Logon to move forward and deliver a finishing blow. To Roland's surprise, the man didn't want to abandon his lady. He was probably afraid that something might happen to her if he moved too far away. TCH. Roland clicked his tongue while firing off another spell towards the other monster. This one dodged slightly to the side and got his horn blown off in the process. It then charged forward the mage that was causing the most trouble. It would have been an easy battle if the two warriors kept the monsters busy. He could then fire off spells from a safe distance. Not protecting your mage was one of the worst things a frontline warrior could do. The creature was now close and charging with its head lowered. It wanted to impale the attacker on its good horn. Roland wasn't such an easy target though. He was someone close to level 70, thanks to the blacksmith class he now had stats comparable to warriors. He grasped his arming sword from the side and waited for the right moment. He used the creature's momentum against it as he dodged to the side. The monster ran past him and came to a stop, but as it was turning around to have another go at it, it saw a flash of blue light. This was the tip of Roland's enchanted sword and the runic version of the mana thrust activating. The condensed magical skill connected with the goat creature's upper body. With Roland's massive mana pool and high intelligence, he could really cause some damage. This was demonstrated by the giant gaping hole that appeared in the monster's humanoid chest. The Bokanok collapsed to the ground right after while giving out a strange wail. Roland then turned around to see the other monster swinging its long lanky arms around. After receiving a hit to the face, it was disoriented but not dead. It possessed a thick skull which made its head not much of a weak point. Finally, Logon decided to move in and delivered a killing blow to the confused creature. He did it only after it got too close to where the woman he was protecting was. The two creatures were dead, and after a bit, the half-orc returned as well. He was covered in scratches and even some holes. Aridhel got to healing his wounds quickly while Roland scratched his head. Besides the two warriors, the acolyte that was supposed to buff the party didn't do anything. The woman lacked combat experience and probably was too nervous to act. Maybe I should have left them in that cave.